Tokyo's story begins not with myth or prophecy, but with the hard certainty of geology. The city sits at one of the most volatile tectonic locations on Earth, where the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, and the Okhotsk Plate all converge in a complex triple junction. This region produces some of the strongest earthquakes recorded in human history, and Japan's scientists have spent decades studying the immense forces accumulating beneath the land and sea. Their findings are not comforting. Government panels warn that the likelihood of a massive magnitude 8 to magnitude 9 event along the Nankai Trough within the next 3 decades is extremely high, with probabilities that have steadily increased as new data emerges. The last major rupture in this system occurred during the 1940s, meaning another powerful event is already overdue according to the historical cycle. Tokyo has already lived through the consequences of a regional megathrust quake. On the first day of September in the year 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake struck with catastrophic force. Measuring an estimated magnitude 7.9, it devastated the region and triggered multiple firestorms that consumed large areas of the city. The disaster remains one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century, and it reshaped Japan's approach to building safety and disaster planning. Yet even that tragedy represents only a fragment of what a full-scale Nankai Trough megathrust rupture could unleash on modern Japan. The danger today is magnified by scale. Greater Tokyo is now home to more than 14 million residents within its core wards, supported by one of the densest and most interconnected infrastructures on the planet. High-rise clusters, elevated expressways, deep subway networks, and intricate energy grids all rest on ground that constantly absorbs and stores tectonic stress. In recent decades, Japan has implemented some of the most rigorous seismic engineering standards in the world, incorporating lessons learned from past disasters, including the Tohoku megathrust event of 2011. But even the strongest systems have limits when confronted with the largest possible earthquakes. In this simulation, the clock begins on an ordinary weekday. Commuters are on their way to work, classrooms are full, and the city hums with its usual energy. Deep beneath the ocean floor, southwest of Tokyo, along the Nankai Trough, centuries of built-up strain approach their breaking point. No one on the surface knows that a rupture line, 200 kilometers long, is about to give way, releasing a surge of energy powerful enough to affect the entire country. This is the beginning of a scenario shaped by real research, real history, and real seismic forecasts. It is not speculation born from fiction, but a grounded exploration of what could happen if the worst-case event struck without warning. Tokyo may be one of the most prepared cities in the world, but in the face of a true megathrust rupture, preparation may not be enough to preserve the city as we know it. The day a megathrust quake strikes begins not with a roar, but with a warning. Japan's earthquake early warning system, one of the most advanced in the world, detects the first seismic P waves traveling through the Earth's crust. Across Greater Tokyo, cell phones simultaneously emit loud alarms. Digital alerts interrupt television broadcasts, while loudspeakers in train stations and public areas broadcast a computerized voice. Earthquake detected, drop cover and hold on. Residents have only seconds to respond, enough to assume protective positions, but not enough to escape the city's built environment. At precisely 11:58 a.m., the first violent motions reach the surface. The initial P wave delivers a sudden vertical jolt, an almost imperceptible precursor to the impending chaos. Moments later, the S wave arrives, producing horizontal shearing, that shakes streets, office towers, and bridges with devastating intensity. In Shinjuku, skyscrapers designed with state-of-the-art seismic dampers sway dramatically, groaning under the stress, while ceiling panels, light fixtures, and unsecured furniture crash to the floor. Despite meticulous engineering, the magnitude of the quake, estimated at 8.7 to 9, pushes even the best construction beyond comfort limits. Below the surface, the subway system becomes a trap. Trains lurch violently, throwing passengers to the floors and causing overhead equipment to collapse. Emergency lighting flickers, then stabilizes, but the tunnels are blocked in several locations by falling debris. Millions of commuters, in the midst of peak hour travel, are stranded underground or amid streets filled with debris and moving hazards. On the streets, chaos dominates. The famed Shibuya Scramble Crossing becomes a scene of mass disarray as pedestrians are thrown off balance. Construction cranes, left unsecured at work sites, topple onto nearby buildings, causing secondary collapses. The roar of collapsing concrete and twisting metal fills the air. Sidewalks buckle, traffic lights crash, and vehicles are crushed or abandoned. In older neighborhoods of East Tokyo, wooden houses suffer catastrophic structural failure. Downed gas lines ignite fires in multiple locations simultaneously, while ruptured water mains hinder firefighting efforts. By 1 p.m., the first hour of the disaster has passed, leaving the city fragmented. Public parks and open squares fill with thousands of frightened residents seeking safety, but access roads are blocked by fallen debris. Hospitals, many running on emergency generators, struggle to accommodate the sudden influx of injured people. Rescue teams attempt to reach trapped individuals, but after shocks force repeated withdrawals. Communications remain compromised as cell towers and fiber optic networks suffer widespread damage. The city, once hyper-connected and organized, now functions as a network of isolated zones, each coping with its own emerging crises. By 4 p.m., fires begin to merge into larger conflagrations. Multiple firestorms spread across dense residential areas, with wind patterns intensifying their growth. Buildings not initially damaged by the shaking are threatened by embers and radiant heat. The skyline, normally a glittering array of lights, is now dominated by smoke and orange glows that pierce the approaching dusk. The first day of a Tokyo megathrust quake has turned the city into a labyrinth of destruction, filled with trapped residents, collapsing infrastructure, and rapidly escalating secondary disasters. This is the moment when preparation meets reality. The city's residents have practiced drills, engineers have designed resilient buildings, and emergency systems are in place. But the scale of the event tests every limit. The first 24 hours set the tone for the survival of the city, the effectiveness of response measures, and the potential human toll. By mid-afternoon, the true scale of the disaster begins to reveal itself. Tokyo's infrastructure, though modern and highly engineered, faces stresses that no planning can fully mitigate. Roads are impassable, bridges sag or collapse entirely, and elevated highways buckle under the violent shaking. The city's subway and train networks, normally the arteries of urban life, are paralyzed, stranding millions underground and on the streets. Emergency vehicles navigate a maze of debris, slowing response times and isolating neighborhoods from rapid assistance. Fires erupt in dozens of districts simultaneously. Many stem from ruptured gas lines and electrical short circuits caused by toppled power lines. Dense wooden neighborhoods in eastern Tokyo, remnants of pre-modern construction, ignite within minutes. Gusts of wind carry embers into adjacent areas, creating the potential for firestorms. In some districts, multiple small fires merge, forming larger infernos that can burn at temperatures exceeding 900 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to weaken steel and ignite modern building materials, firefighters face blocked streets, collapsed water mains, and a shortage of available personnel, making containment almost impossible. Meanwhile, aftershocks, some registering magnitude 6 to 7, continue to rattle the city. Each tremor topples weakened structures, reignites fires, and causes panic among residents. Emergency shelters and parks and schools quickly become overcrowded, as tens of thousands seek safety in open spaces. Even these areas are not entirely secure. Falling debris from surrounding buildings presents ongoing hazards, and lack of sanitation and clean water begins to emerge as a secondary crisis. Critical services falter. Hospitals struggle to provide care as power intermittently fails, elevators stall, and operating rooms are forced to switch to battery-backed lighting. Communication networks are severely disrupted. Cell towers are damaged, telephone lines are severed, and internet access becomes unreliable. Coordination between city authorities, the national government, and the Japanese self-defense forces is slowed by this breakdown, making organized relief operations nearly impossible in the first hours. The economic impact starts immediately. Key industrial and commercial districts are damaged, halting manufacturing and logistics. Stock exchanges and major banks suspend operations. Transportation hubs, including Narita and Haneda airports, suffer structural damage and operational delays, isolating Tokyo from domestic and international support. Millions of commuters are trapped, and essential supply chains for food, fuel, and medical supplies begin to fray. By 8 p.m., as night falls, Tokyo is a city divided. Pockets of relative safety surrounded by zones of chaos, fire, and destruction. The fire's glow illuminates the smoke-filled skies, a haunting reminder of the quake's reach. Tens of thousands remain trapped in collapsed buildings, While the first estimates of casualties and property damage are staggering, though impossible to quantify accurately at this stage, the combination of structural collapse, fires, and overwhelmed emergency services sets the stage for a multi-day crisis that will challenge the city's resilience like never before. The first day demonstrates that even the most prepared megacity is vulnerable to the immense power of tectonic forces. While some areas endure relatively intact, the cascading failures across infrastructure, transportation, and utilities show how quickly a modern metropolis can fragment under the strain of a megathrust earthquake. Even amid chaos, Tokyo's advanced engineering and disaster planning begin to show their value. Modern skyscrapers, particularly in Shinjuku and Marunouchi, are equipped with tuned mass dampers, base isolation systems, and reinforced frames designed to sway safely during magnitude 8 to 9 tremors. These systems prevent catastrophic collapse for most high-rise buildings, buying crucial time for evacuation and reducing casualties. Bridges and highways built to absorb seismic motion flex rather than fail completely, although some older structures in less maintained districts sustain serious damage or partial collapse. The city's fire prevention measures also activate fire hydrants with backup reservoirs and automated sprinkler systems in modern complexes reduce the spread of fire in commercial areas. In districts with wooden housing, authorities prioritize open spaces such as stadiums, school grounds, and public parks as temporary fire breaks and assembly points. Despite these measures, high winds and ruptured gas lines allow some fires to continue spreading, demonstrating that no city plan can completely neutralize natural disasters of this magnitude. Underground infrastructure plays a critical role. The Metropolitan Outer Area Underground Discharge Channel, normally used for flood control, helps manage water flow from ruptured pipes and prevents localized flooding that could compound rescue challenges. Subway tunnels, though damaged, provide shelter for some who were trapped underground, and emergency lighting allows limited movement until power can be restored. The Japanese self-defense forces are mobilized quickly, coordinating with local police and fire departments. Helicopters survey the city from above, mapping damaged zones and identifying high-priority rescue sites. Drones and satellite imagery supplement these efforts, helping responders bypass blocked roads and debris-strewn streets. Command centers rely on hardened communications networks that survived the initial quake, allowing for a more organized deployment of resources than would otherwise be possible. Medical response is a race against time. Hospitals that remain operational triage patients based on severity, while mobile medical units and temporary field hospitals are set up in large parks and parking area. International aid is coordinated via Japan's diplomatic channels, although the scale of the disaster makes initial assistance limited. Early responders focus on rescuing individuals trapped in buildings, stabilizing severe injuries, and preventing secondary hazards such as fires, landslides, and water contamination. By the evening of the first day, the effectiveness of Tokyo's preparation is clear. Many modern structures remain standing, fires in commercial areas are partially contained, and emergency services are beginning to regain control in sections of the city. Yet the overall picture is sobering. Significant casualties, widespread homelessness, and crippling economic damage remain. The city's resilience is remarkable, but even the most advanced engineering and planning cannot prevent a megathrust earthquake from inflicting severe destruction in a single day. The hours following the quake highlight a critical lesson. Technology, planning, and human coordination can mitigate the worst effects, but survival in a city of 14 million during a mega disaster requires vigilance, preparation, and rapid action. Tokyo is far from destroyed, but the challenges ahead for recovery will be immense, spanning days, months, and even years. 24 hours after the hypothetical megaquake, Tokyo is unrecognizable. Streets are littered with debris, collapsed buildings, and damaged vehicles. Smoke and fires from ruptured gas lines still rise from the eastern districts, casting an orange haze across the skyline. Emergency shelters are overcrowded as hundreds of thousands of residents seek refuge, and makeshift medical tents work tirelessly to treat the injured. The human toll is staggering. In a worst-case scenario modeled for a magnitude 8 to 9 Nankai trough event, thousands could be killed instantly by building collapses, falling debris, and fires, while tens of thousands more sustain serious injuries. Evacuation routes remain partially blocked, slowing relief efforts and leaving some neighborhoods isolated. Communication networks are gradually restored, but for many, access to news, emergency services, and loved ones remains limited. Economic disruption is immediate and profound. Tokyo, the heart of Japan's economy, sees its financial markets, factories, and offices paralyzed. Power grids are partially offline, transportation networks are in chaos, and international trade faces delays as ports and airports sustain structural damage. Economic analysts estimate that a catastrophic quake along the Nankai Trough could result in losses reaching trillions of dollars across supply chains, infrastructure repair, and lost productivity. Environmental consequences also emerge. Collapsed buildings release dust, hazardous materials, and debris into waterways, while fires create air pollution and hazards for first responders. The combination of aftershocks and weakened structures poses ongoing risks, prompting evacuation orders from unsafe buildings. Experts warn that landslides and soil liquefaction in certain districts could continue for days, further complicating rescue operations. Despite the devastation, Tokyo's preparedness prevents total collapse. Emergency response protocols, trained personnel, and disaster-resistant structures save countless lives. Fire breaks, reinforced hospitals, and rapid deployment of the self-defense forces help contain further catastrophes, illustrating the importance of decades of seismic planning and lessons learned from past events, such as the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake and the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. Long-term recovery will be measured in years, rebuilding damaged neighborhoods, restoring transportation and utility networks, and providing mental health and social support to survivors are monumental tasks. Urban planners anticipate redesigning vulnerable areas with improved seismic resilience, while policymakers push for accelerated retrofitting of older buildings. International assistance may be required to supplement Japan's resources, as the scale of economic and infrastructural damage exceeds what even the most prepared cities can fully absorb. The day after the quake is a testament to both human vulnerability and resilience. Tokyo is not erased, but it is wounded. Its systems stressed, its people traumatized, and its economic engines slowed. Yet the survival of critical infrastructure and the rapid response demonstrate that with preparation, advanced engineering, and coordinated planning, even one of the largest and most densely populated cities on Earth can endure a catastrophic seismic event. The hypothetical scenario ultimately underscores a sobering truth. A megaquake could destroy the Tokyo we know in a single day, crippling its infrastructure, claiming lives, and causing immense economic and social upheaval. But the city's resilience, planning, and innovation provide a path for survival and eventual recovery, reminding the world that understanding and preparing for natural hazards is essential in the age of urban megacities. It starts on what should be an uneventful afternoon across the Central Plains. The sky is calm, a clear stretch of blue from horizon to horizon, until a faint shadow forms in the distant west. At first it looks like an approaching line of storms, but the shape is wrong. There are no flashes of lightning, no towering thunderheads. Instead, the horizon darkens into a solid rising wall, an advancing mass of airborne earth driven by powerful winds. As it grows, it becomes clear that this is not an ordinary weather front. It is a massive dust storm, the kind meteorologists classify as a large-scale haboob, capable of swallowing cities and smothering daylight in minutes. When the storm arrives, it does not feel sudden, yet it hits with overwhelming force. Wind gusts surpassing roughly 60 miles per hour push the dust forward like a moving cliff of soil, gravel, and pulverized topsoil ripped from dry fields. The moment the front reaches populated areas, daylight collapses. Streets, neighborhoods, and farm roads are thrown into near total darkness as visibility drops to only a few feet. Anyone caught outside is immediately disoriented, reduced to seeing only their hands in front of their face, the air thick with choking grit. Within moments, panic ripples across highways as drivers lose all sense of direction. Headlights become useless beams scattered by swirling particles, forcing motorists to halt wherever they are, on shoulders, in lanes, or even in the middle of intersections. Emergency dispatchers are inundated with calls, reporting stalled vehicles, lost drivers, and minor collisions caused by the blinding conditions. As the sun disappears behind the storm's towering edge, the temperature begins to drop. Without direct sunlight, large areas can experience a rapid decline in heat, potentially falling by 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in under an hour. The air becomes noticeably cooler adding a sharp bite to the already suffocating atmosphere. Inside homes and businesses, lights flicker on automatically, but they do little to cut through the swirling blackness outside. The abrasive sound of dust scraping against windows and metal siding replaces the usual daytime noise. Even those safely indoors begin to sense that something unprecedented is unfolding. The reality sinks in. This is not a passing dust plume or a short-lived weather oddity. This is the beginning of a regional blackout created entirely by earth and wind. And in this first hour, before systems fail, before agriculture suffers, before the long-term consequences set in, the plains find themselves plunged into a darkness so complete and so immediate that millions of people struggle to understand what has just happened. As the darkness stretches beyond the first hour, the disaster shifts from a terrifying atmospheric event to a full-scale systems crisis. The storm does not weaken, instead it spreads, covering hundreds of miles of open land and densely populated areas. Across the plains, one of the earliest major failures begins in the energy sector. Many states in this region rely on large solar installations for a meaningful share of daytime electricity. When the dust wall arrives, those facilities go dark instantly. Panels that normally absorb sunlight are now trapped beneath layers of gritty sediment, producing virtually no power. This rapid collapse of solar generation happens at the exact moment millions of people are switching on lights, air purifiers, and emergency devices to cope with the darkness. The grid suddenly faces a dual stressor, a steep loss in energy supply paired with a sharp spike in demand. While grid operators can draw from reserve sources or activate natural gas plants, the shift is abrupt enough that rolling blackouts begin to appear in scattered communities. These outages deepen the confusion and make communication difficult as cell towers and small substations begin operating on backup power. Meanwhile, the air itself is becoming more hazardous by the minute. Dust storms of this magnitude carry extremely fine particulate matter known as PM 2.5, particles small enough to bypass the body's natural defenses and settle deep in the lungs. Even those indoors are not fully protected. Modern buildings with high-efficiency filtration can reduce exposure, but many homes across rural parts of the plains rely on basic HVAC systems that cannot stop microscopic particles. As filters clog, indoor air quality drops sharply, forcing people to seal windows and door frames with towels or plastic to slow the infiltration of dust. Hospitals and clinics begin to see a rise in respiratory distress cases. For people with asthma, chronic lung conditions, or compromised immune systems, prolonged exposure to airborne dust can trigger dangerous inflammation. While today's medical understanding is far better than during the Dust Bowl era, the health risk remains very real, and medical facilities must quickly ration masks, inhalers, and oxygen supplies. Transportation networks also falter. Highways remain gridlocked or temporarily shut down as visibility stays near zero. Rail operations slow dramatically because train engineers cannot safely navigate through opaque, dust-filled air, and sensors along tracks begin to malfunction due to grid accumulation. Air travel across the region is suspended altogether, as airports have no safe runway visibility and aircraft engines cannot operate reliably in the abrasive storm. By the 12th hour, the dust storm has exposed how interdependent modern systems truly are. One environmental shock has already begun to strain power, transportation, healthcare, and communication networks, and while the storm will eventually weaken, the cascading failures it triggers are only beginning to unfold. By the third day, the storm has evolved into something less violent but far more unsettling. The towering wall of dust is no longer sweeping across the plains at full force, yet the sky is still shrouded in a dense reddish-brown haze. Sunlight manages to push through in faint muted bands, creating an eerie twilight that lingers from morning to evening. Although the immediate danger of complete blackout has passed, this sustained dimming introduces a new set of challenges that grow more serious with each passing hour. Agriculture, one of the defining features of the plains, starts to show visible signs of stress. Crops like corn, wheat, and soybeans depend heavily on consistent sunlight for photosynthesis, and the prolonged haze limits the amount of solar energy they can absorb. Scientific studies have shown that high concentrations of airborne particulate matter can reduce the amount of available sunlight by a significant percentage, which in turn decreases crop productivity. Even short disruptions can cause measurable losses. For farmers already operating on tight seasonal windows, a multi-day reduction in light, and a layer of abrasive dust covering leaves can jeopardize their entire year's yield. Livestock operations face their own problems. Dust settling on open water sources increases contamination risk, and grazing lands are coated with sediment that animals can inhale or ingest. Many ranchers are forced to relocate cattle into sheltered areas, if available, to reduce exposure. Although modern veterinary care helps mitigate some dangers, prolonged dust inhalation can still cause respiratory irritation and reduced feeding. Transportation remains heavily restricted. The storm's lingering haze drastically limits visibility for aircraft, keeping many regional airports grounded. On highways, blowing dust and leftover drifts continue to create hazards, especially in open rural stretches. Rail networks face delays as maintenance crews work to clear dust accumulation from critical track components, sensors, and switches. These disruptions ripple outward, slowing the movement of food, fuel, and medical supplies. Supply chains that rely on predictable schedules begin to unravel. Warehouses depend on timely deliveries, and shortages emerge when trucks and trains fail to move goods efficiently. While businesses and emergency services tap into stored reserves, these supplies were never designed to support long-term regional outages. Communities on the outer edges of the affected zones start to notice reduced availability of essentials, like fresh produce, livestock feed, and replacement air filters. Public health agencies issue new advisories warning residents that PM 2.5 concentrations remain elevated. Even though winds have weakened, fine particles stay suspended in the atmosphere for days due to their extremely small size. Hospitals report a steady growing demand for respiratory treatments, particularly in smaller towns that lack specialized equipment. By the end of the 72-hour mark, the region is caught in a delicate balance. The worst of the storm may have passed, but the lingering haze, damaged crops, strained supply chains, and ongoing health risks reveal how quickly a massive dust event can reshape daily life. The plains are no longer in immediate darkness, yet the path to recovery is already proving far more difficult than anyone expected. By the end of the first week, the massive dust storm has largely passed, but the crisis is far from over. Winds have calmed, yet the air remains filled with fine particulate matter, making outdoor activity hazardous without proper respiratory protection. Even a simple walk outside can expose people to PM 2.5 particles, which penetrate deep into the lungs and aggravate pre-existing conditions such as asthma or chronic bronchitis. Public health warnings continue, emphasizing that staying indoors with sealed ventilation systems is the safest option for most residents. The most visible impact is on the land itself. Dust that was airborne for days is now settling, forming thick layers across streets, farmland, and rural infrastructure. Roads, fences, and farm equipment are buried under a suffocating blanket of soil. Vehicles, tractors, and construction machinery must be cleaned and inspected before they can operate safely, while critical road and rail networks require extensive clearing to resume normal traffic. For many rural communities, small-town streets resemble a desert landscape, and the sheer volume of deposited dust overwhelms local cleanup capabilities. Agriculture suffers further setbacks as the accumulated dust covers crops and grazing land. While some plants survive under the layer of sediment, many are stunted, and the potential yield of wheat, corn, and soybeans declines significantly. Soil quality is altered, nutrient-rich topsoil may be stripped from some areas, leaving less fertile ground, while in other locations, the deposited dust adds weight and density that can harm young plants. Livestock, meanwhile, continue to struggle with contaminated water sources and grazing fields, forcing ranchers to implement emergency feeding strategies. The economic fallout begins to compound. Cleaning the dust is costly and labor-intensive. Machinery and vehicles may require repairs from abrasive dust damage, while industrial operations that rely on clean air intake, such as manufacturing plants, face production slowdowns or temporary shutdowns. Hospitals and clinics experience increased patient loads due to respiratory issues, adding pressure to already strained healthcare systems. Insurance claims for property damage, crop loss, and infrastructure repairs mount rapidly, putting additional strain on local and regional resources. Transportation remains challenged despite calmer winds. Airport operations continue to experience delays as residual dust clouds affect visibility. Highways and rural roads, partially buried under silt, impede deliveries of essential goods, slowing the movement of food, fuel, and emergency supplies. Rail systems work to restore functionality, but face delays due to sediment accumulation, in critical track areas, and mechanical equipment exposed to dust damage. By the 7th day, the massive dust storm has shifted from an immediate threat to a lingering hazard. The air is clearing gradually, yet the economic, environmental, and public health impacts remain severe. The plains are visibly transformed, communities face significant cleanup challenges, and the strain on agriculture, transportation, and healthcare illustrates how a single, prolonged dust storm can leave long-lasting scars across the region. The initial shock has passed, but the path to full recovery is just beginning. 1 month after the dust storm swept across the plains, the skies are finally clearer, but the aftermath is still painfully visible. Communities are coated in a layer of fine dust, both inside homes and on every surface outside. Even after extensive cleanup, residual sediment continues to affect air quality, clogging ventilation systems and forcing ongoing use of protective masks. Many households and businesses are dealing with long-term damage to electronics, machinery, and vehicles that were exposed to abrasive particles. Agriculture is facing the most enduring consequences. Fields that were buried under thick layers of dust have reduced fertility, while crops that survived the storm show delayed growth due to sunlight deprivation and mechanical damage from wind-blown soil. Livestock operations continue to struggle with partially contaminated grazing areas and water sources, forcing farmers to bring in supplementary feed and water for several weeks. These challenges threaten local and regional food supply chains, with economic losses mounting across the heartland. Transportation and logistics remain disrupted. Rural roads, bridges, and rail lines take time to fully reopen, especially in remote communities where sediment accumulation was heaviest. The initial disruption in supply chains has created cascading shortages in grocery stores, fuel depots, and medical facilities, with some smaller towns experiencing scarcity for weeks. Nationally, the economic impact extends beyond the plains as the cost of rebuilding, cleaning, and supplementing lost agricultural output strains regional budgets. The psychological toll on residents is significant. Living through near total darkness, breathing hazardous air, and witnessing the transformation of familiar landscapes into dust-choked wastelands leaves lasting stress. Emergency responders, farmers, and community members alike face months of recovery work, testing both physical endurance and mental resilience. The storm becomes a historical benchmark, a reminder of how quickly nature can overwhelm even modern systems and infrastructure. Environmentally, the plains have been altered. Wind and rain following the storm continue to redistribute dust, affecting soil composition in surrounding areas and creating higher vulnerability to erosion and future droughts. While a single event does not recreate the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, it does highlight the potential for human activity and climate conditions to exacerbate natural hazards, leaving the land more fragile than before. By the end of the first month, life slowly returns to a semblance of normalcy. Power grids have stabilized, supply chains are catching up, and air quality gradually improves. Yet the memory of the blackout, the suffocating dust, and the disruptions to daily life remains vivid. This hypothetical scenario underscores that while massive dust storms may seem extreme, their potential to disrupt agriculture, infrastructure, public health, and psychology is real and measurable. The plains have endured the storm, but the lingering shadow serves as a stark warning of nature's immense and often underestimated power. The first indication that something catastrophic has occurred isn't a siren or explosion, it's the absence of light. Across the eastern seaboard, cities and suburbs that normally glow with electricity are suddenly plunged into complete darkness. Streetlights flicker out, office towers go black, and homes are silent except for the occasional hum of a generator. This is not a typical outage caused by weather or technical malfunction. Experts have long warned that a coordinated cyber attack on the operational technology controlling the power grid could trigger a simultaneous shutdown across multiple regions. And now that warning has become reality. Within minutes, the effects cascade. Breakers and substations and control systems are manipulated remotely, effectively locking the grid in a failed state. Unlike a physical attack, the perpetrators never set foot in the United States. They are manipulating systems from thousands of miles away, using sophisticated malware designed to bypass normal safety protocols. The US power grid is divided into interconnections: Eastern, Western, and Texas. In this scenario, the malware targets critical nodes in the Eastern interconnection, causing a blackout that stretches from Boston to Atlanta. Traffic lights go dark instantly, subway systems halt, and millions of commuters are trapped in the chaos. communication systems begin to degrade rapidly. Cell towers rely on backup generators that can last only a few hours. And as usage spikes from panicked citizens attempting to call family members, networks become overloaded, internet connectivity falters as data centers struggle to maintain power and cooling without electricity. Social media explodes with reports and hashtags, but the flood of information overwhelms the very systems people are trying to use for updates. Hospitals switch to emergency generators, which power only essential equipment. MRI machines, Connecticut scanners, and connected medical devices cease functioning outside critical areas. Emergency services like fire departments and ambulance networks are immediately stressed. Without traffic signals and functioning communication, response times increase dramatically. In this first hour, society operates on inertia and the limited energy stored in batteries, cell phones, flashlights, and backup systems. Yet the awareness of a widespread attack begins to set in. What makes this first hour especially dangerous is the unknown. Citizens do not know whether this blackout is temporary, a natural disaster, or the opening salvo of a more extensive campaign. Governments and utilities have contingency plans, but even the most sophisticated protocols are tested to their limits in a simultaneous, multi-state cyber event. The uncertainty, combined with the sudden disappearance of power, creates a psychological tension that surpasses physical danger. By the end of 60 minutes, the first tangible consequences are visible. Gridlock paralyzes major roadways. People are trapped in elevators and subway cars. Data-dependent systems, from financial transactions to water treatment facilities, begin to strain, though the full effects are yet to unfold. The line of code that started this attack has done more than shut down machines. It has instantly disrupted the rhythm of everyday life, exposing the fragility of the infrastructure Americans rely on without thinking. This is the digital Pearl Harbor, silent, invisible, and devastating. In just 1 hour, the foundations of modern civilization, electricity, communication, and transportation, are under siege. The next moments as the blackout spreads will determine how quickly society can respond or how deeply the attack will spiral into a prolonged disaster. As the blackout moves past its second hour, the realization that this is not a temporary outage begins to settle in. The cascading failures now reach the essential systems that underpin society: healthcare, finance, and communications. Hospitals, while running on emergency generators, face limitations almost immediately. Generators provide power only for life-sustaining equipment, leaving administrative systems and non-critical medical devices offline. Electronic health records, which contain patient histories, allergies, and ongoing treatments, are inaccessible. Clinicians are forced to rely on memory, paper charts, and improvisation. In 2024, an outage at a major U.S. healthcare provider temporarily disrupted electronic records nationwide, offering a small preview of the chaos, but the current scenario is exponentially more severe. The financial system is simultaneously crippled. Major banks, ATMs, and payment processors rely on digital networks that are now offline. Debit and credit cards stop working, digital transfers stall, and stock exchanges pause trading. People who depend solely on electronic money are cut off, unable to access savings or purchase essentials. Cash, once largely obsolete for daily use, regains immense value. Analysts have warned for years that a simultaneous cyber attack on banking infrastructure could trigger rapid economic panic. Now the theory becomes reality. Communications degrade rapidly. Cell towers run on limited battery reserves, and as millions attempt to call loved ones or access news, networks collapse under the volume. Major news outlets scramble to maintain emergency radio broadcasts, but their reach is limited. Social media platforms, once alive with hashtags and updates, slow to a crawl or become entirely inaccessible. Even small internet service providers begin to fail as the demand for connectivity overwhelms backup systems. The United States, for all its technological sophistication, is now facing an information vacuum. People know only that something is wrong, but not why or how extensive the attack is. Emergency response systems are immediately challenged. Dispatch centers for police, fire, and medical services are inundated with calls. Without traffic signals and with widespread gridlock on major highways, ambulances and fire trucks struggle to reach critical locations. National protocols like the National Cyber Incident Response Plan are activated, mobilizing agencies such as CISA, DHS, and the FBI. However, their operations are hindered by the very infrastructure they are attempting to secure. Coordination across agencies is slowed by compromised communications, leaving field units to make split-second decisions without centralized guidance. By hour 6, the cumulative strain on society becomes evident. Water treatment facilities that rely on electricity begin to fail, risking contamination and shortages. Refrigerated and frozen food in homes, stores, and hospitals spoil as supply chains are disrupted. Gas stations without functioning pumps leave drivers stranded, creating lines and congestion in the few areas still accessible. Panic buying intensifies as citizens anticipate prolonged shortages. As the 12th hour approaches, the US faces a new reality. The failure of systems designed with redundancies and fail-safes has revealed the fragility of modern life. Critical infrastructure, electricity, finance, healthcare, and communications has become interdependent in ways that amplify the effects of a single attack. For millions, the day that began with darkness has transformed into a life-altering crisis. Society has not yet descended into chaos, but the foundations for widespread disruption are firmly in place. The first half day of the attack underscores a chilling truth. When a cyber attack targets operational technology and critical networks simultaneously, the consequences are not confined to the digital realm. They ripple instantly through every corner of daily life. By the end of 12 hours, the United States is no longer just experiencing a technical failure. It is beginning to feel the human and social impact of a digital siege. As the sun rises on the second day, the full scope of the crisis begins to reveal itself. The digital blackout has transformed from a technological failure into a human one. People wake to empty refrigerators, stalled vehicles, and streets filled with abandoned cars. The reliance on digital logistics and just-in-time supply chains becomes painfully clear. These systems, which manage everything from grocery deliveries to fuel distribution, require constant data flow and communication. With networks down and transportation systems immobilized, supply chains grind to a halt. Fuel shortages become immediately apparent. Gas stations that have mechanical pumps or small emergency generators become focal points of desperation. Lines stretch for miles, and drivers ration whatever fuel remains. During the Colonial Pipeline shutdown in 2021, a 5-day outage caused widespread panic in a single region. Now imagine that scenario nationwide, with no timeline for restoration. Transportation of food, medicine, and emergency supplies is delayed indefinitely, amplifying the risk to urban and rural populations alike. Grocery stores face rapid depletion of essential goods. Refrigeration systems fail without electricity, causing perishable items to spoil. Bottled water, canned foods, and dry staples vanish from shelves within hours. Panic buying and hoarding intensify as households realize that restocking is impossible. In some areas, bartering emerges as a practical necessity. Water, batteries, and fuel become the new currency. The immediate convenience of modern life is replaced with a raw struggle for survival. Water and sanitation systems are next. Water treatment plants require electricity to maintain pressure and purify supply. Once backup generators fail or fuel runs out, taps run dry, toilets no longer flush, and the risk of waterborne diseases rises dramatically. This is not a theoretical threat. In 2023, the EPA reported that cybersecurity vulnerabilities exist in nearly half of US water utilities, illustrating how easily attackers could compromise these systems. Without clean water, hygiene deteriorates and illness spreads, particularly affecting vulnerable populations such as the elderly and children. Healthcare is further strained, hospitals have limited supplies, and chronic care becomes a critical concern. Patients dependent on insulin, dialysis, or other essential treatments face life-threatening situations. Clinics without power cannot provide basic care, and emergency response teams are stretched thin, forced to prioritize immediate life or death cases. The mortality risk from indirect effects, spoiled medications, untreated chronic conditions, and infectious disease is significant. Social tensions escalate. Without official information, rumors and fear spread rapidly. Communities fracture along lines of access to resources and security. Some neighborhoods form organized groups to protect supplies and help vulnerable members. Others experience rising crime, theft, and conflict as desperation grows. Trust in government and institutional guidance is severely eroded. Communication breakdown leaves citizens relying primarily on word of mouth and local knowledge. By the end of day 3, the United States is facing a reality unimaginable just 72 hours earlier. the immediate technological failure has cascaded into societal disruption. Shortages, health risks, and social unrest dominate daily life. People are learning rapidly and painfully how dependent they are on electricity, digital networks, and coordinated supply chains. The digital attack has now fully crossed into the physical and social realms, setting the stage for prolonged disruption. By the fourth day, the initial shock of the cyber attack has given way to a grim, grinding reality. While cybersecurity teams and hidden command centers work tirelessly to regain control of the compromised networks, communities in the dark face an escalating struggle for survival. Local services that remained functional on generator, power, or manual systems are now severely limited. Streets grow unsanitary as trash collection halts, sewage systems begin to fail, and rodents and pests proliferate. In many urban areas, residents are forced to improvise, creating rudimentary sanitation systems and rationing food and water to survive. Engineers and cybersecurity experts confront an unprecedented technical challenge. The malware embedded in the grid and industrial control systems is sophisticated, designed to trigger physical damage if systems are restored incorrectly. Transformers and substations may be at risk if power is reintroduced too quickly, making every attempt to restart the grid a delicate operation. Specialists employ black start procedures, bringing small generators online and gradually energizing local sections of the network. But progress is painstakingly slow and fraught with danger. Each step must balance supply and demand carefully, or risk triggering a cascade of further failures. The social consequences intensify. As power remains scarce, people with fuel for vehicles attempt to leave the hardest hit areas, causing severe congestion and blocking evacuation routes. In some neighborhoods, community members form patrols to safeguard resources and protect the vulnerable, effectively creating micro-societies. In contrast, other areas experience opportunistic crime, looting, and disorder as law enforcement struggles to maintain a presence. The patchwork of stability and chaos highlights the uneven impact of the blackout across different regions. Economic disruption deepens. Businesses that rely on electronic systems remain shuttered. Manufacturing plants stop production entirely, and transportation networks cannot deliver goods. The Department of Energy has previously estimated that standard outages cost the US up to $150 billion annually. A nationwide cyber-induced blackout magnifies that impact exponentially. People who survive the immediate physical threats now face financial insecurity, shortages of essentials, and uncertainty about the weeks to come. By day 5, the psychological toll is severe. The information vacuum created by non-functioning media and communications fosters widespread fear and paranoia. Residents rely on rumors, social media snippets when they can access a connection, and word of mouth for guidance. Mistrust spreads, both between communities and toward authorities, as official updates remain sparse. The National Guard is deployed to secure critical sites like fuel depots, food warehouses, and hospitals, but their limited numbers mean they cannot intervene everywhere. In some areas, their presence reassures civilians. In others, it fuels tension as martial law is felt, not announced. The interdependence of systems becomes painfully clear. Water, food, fuel, and medical services all rely on electricity and connectivity. When one component fails, others follow. The once invisible networks that sustain modern life have become lifelines under siege. Each day that passes without full restoration intensifies the consequences of the attack, deepening the gap between those who have access to resources and those who do not. By the 7th day, society has fractured into isolated zones of functionality and darkness. Some communities manage to create local systems of governance, sharing resources and maintaining order. Others descend into chaos, with abandoned vehicles, spoiled food, and failing sanitation marking a landscape of crisis. The digital and physical worlds, once separate in concept, have now merged into a single fragile reality where survival depends on resourcefulness, cooperation, and sheer resilience. The first week serves as a sobering reminder that a cyber attack on critical infrastructure is not just a technological event, it is a societal earthquake. The systems that underpin life in America are interwoven and vulnerable, and when they fail, the consequences are immediate, visible, and profoundly human. By the second week, the blackout has become a grim, long-term reality. The initial chaos has subsided into a relentless struggle for survival. For millions still without power, life revolves entirely around securing food, water, and fuel. Streets that were once bustling with activity are now marked by scarcity. Abandoned vehicles, shuttered businesses, and people scavenging for essentials. The country is no longer functioning as a unified system. Daily existence has fractured into micro-survivals based on location, resources, and access to functioning infrastructure. Efforts to restore the power grid continue, but face immense obstacles. Engineers discover that the attackers not only shut down systems, but also deliberately sabotaged key components, including massive custom-built transformers. These transformers are difficult to replace, taking months or even years to manufacture, and stockpiles are minimal. Black Start efforts proceed slowly, with small sections of the grid coming online intermittently. Each restoration must be carefully balanced, as a misstep could trigger another catastrophic failure. Supply chains remain severely disrupted. Trucks cannot deliver goods due to fuel shortages and blocked highways, while food, medicine, and other critical resources dwindle in homes, stores, and warehouses. Communities adapt by rationing, scavenging, and creating barter systems. Items once taken for granted, such as antibiotics, clean water, and canned food, now carry immense value. People quickly learn to prioritize essential survival over convenience, and local ingenuity becomes crucial. Public health deteriorates. Without refrigeration and clean water, foodborne illnesses spread more easily, and chronic conditions become life-threatening. Hospitals are overwhelmed with both trauma cases from accidents and patients suffering from untreated conditions. Mental health also suffers. Anxiety, fear, and the stress of prolonged uncertainty affect all age groups. Deaths from indirect effects, starvation, infection, untreated disease begin to mount, far surpassing immediate casualties from the blackout itself. Government response shifts focus. FEMA and military pivot from maintaining order to providing humanitarian relief. Safe zones are established in areas with intermittent power where food, water, and medical aid are distributed. Military convoys transport supplies to these centers, but the scale of the crisis prevents coverage for everyone. Outside these zones, communities are largely on their own, forced to self-organize and secure resources independently. Society undergoes a profound transformation. Local councils, citizen patrols, and community watch groups emerge to fill gaps left by failing institutions. Barter economies and informal trade replace conventional commerce. Trust in centralized authority erodes as promises of swift restoration prove hollow. Survival becomes both a practical and psychological challenge, emphasizing adaptability, self-reliance, and neighborly cooperation. By the end of the first month, the United States has split into two distinct realities: areas with partial or restored power, and vast regions still in darkness. Life for those in the unpowered zones has regressed by centuries. The fight is no longer about restoring electricity alone. It is about preserving basic human needs and sustaining communities under extreme duress. The blackout has exposed the full fragility of modern civilization, showing how quickly dependency on digital systems can unravel into a harsh, enduring reality. As the timeline stretches into months, the immediate shock of the cyber attack evolves into a persistent period of hardship and adaptation. While some cities regain partial electricity, large swaths of the nation remain in darkness, particularly in regions where physical infrastructure suffered the most extensive sabotage. Communities must rely on stored fuel, local generators, and alternative energy sources to maintain even minimal functionality. For many, daily life becomes a careful balance of conserving resources, maintaining hygiene, and protecting dwindling supplies. The economic consequences are profound. Tens of thousands of businesses, already fragile after weeks of inactivity, permanently close. Digital assets that disappeared in the initial attack remain unrecoverable, and the collapse of e-commerce and financial networks has erased vast amounts of wealth. Hyperinflation begins to take hold in areas where limited goods are available, with prices of essentials skyrocketing. Ordinary currency loses much of its practical value, and communities increasingly turn to bartering or alternative forms of exchange. Government priorities shift to long-term recovery and national security. Emergency cybersecurity legislation is enacted, mandating stringent standards for all critical infrastructure operators. Agencies like CISA gain unprecedented authority and resources, and private companies are compelled to adopt zero trust and network segmentation practices. Investment in domestic manufacturing, agriculture, and decentralized energy production surges, driven by the lessons learned from the vulnerability of centralized systems. Society adapts in unexpected ways. Local self-sufficiency becomes crucial. People learn to grow food, purify water, and repair essential tools without relying on digital guidance. A resurgence in analog skills occurs across generations, emphasizing practical knowledge over technological convenience. Communities become more insular, focusing on protecting their own resources and ensuring the survival of their members, rather than relying on distant authorities. Public health challenges persist. Malnutrition and untreated chronic illnesses continue to take a toll, while contaminated water and limited medical care maintain a steady risk of disease outbreaks. Education systems reliant on digital networks are disrupted indefinitely, forcing parents and local groups to improvise learning environments. Children and teenagers grow up in a drastically different reality, where basic survival skills are as important as traditional knowledge. The long-term psychological impact is significant. Citizens experience chronic stress and trauma. From weeks and months of uncertainty, scarcity, and loss, social bonds are simultaneously strained and strengthened. While conflict over limited resources occurs, communities that cooperate develop resilience and trust. This new way of life reshapes social norms, creating a culture that values preparation, resourcefulness, and local governance above centralized convenience. By the 6-month mark, a new American landscape has emerged. The nation is patchworked between zones of restored functionality and regions still enduring prolonged darkness. Society is poorer, more fragmented, and more cautious. The attack has permanently altered how people perceive security infrastructure and dependence on technology. Life has slowly adjusted to a hybrid reality, where resilience and self-reliance define survival, setting the stage for the next chapter: the lasting changes in a post-cyber attack world. 1 year after the massive cyber attack, the United States is transformed. The immediate fight for survival has ended, but the long-term consequences continue to shape society, infrastructure, and governance. On the geopolitical stage, intelligence agencies have traced the digital fingerprints of the attack, attributing it to sophisticated nation-state actors. Instead of conventional warfare, this conflict was waged in the shadows of cyberspace, targeting critical infrastructure and exposing vulnerabilities that had long been underestimated. Domestically, rebuilding efforts focus on decentralization and resilience. The old power grid is replaced in part by regional microgrids designed to limit cascading failures in the future. Investment in cybersecurity has surged across public and private sectors. New regulations mandate secure system designs and continuous monitoring for critical infrastructure, while companies are required to separate operational technology from corporate networks to prevent a single point of failure. CISA, once a relatively obscure agency within DHS, now wields significant authority, reflecting the elevated importance of digital security to national survival. Society itself has been permanently altered. Many citizens embrace an analog lifestyle, relying on cash, local food supplies, and low-tech solutions for daily needs. Communities have internalized lessons about preparedness, self-sufficiency, and local governance. The attack left an enduring cultural memory, a realization that digital convenience comes with profound risks. Trust in technology is tempered with caution, and individuals prioritize redundancy in their personal and community systems. The economy slowly recovers, but with a new focus. Domestic manufacturing, agriculture, and critical infrastructure are now considered national security priorities. Dependence on foreign suppliers for essential components, from microchips to electrical equipment, is sharply reduced. The attack has forced a reconsideration of supply chain resilience, technological reliance, and strategic autonomy. Education and workforce skills have shifted as well. Emphasis on cybersecurity, engineering, and survival skills becomes widespread, and a new generation grows up acutely aware of the vulnerabilities of interconnected systems. Digital literacy now includes awareness of threats, protective measures, and crisis planning, reflecting the changed national consciousness. Social structures are permanently influenced. Some regions maintain high-tech capabilities, while others retain more self-reliant, low-tech lifestyles. The digital divide has evolved into a survival divide, where preparedness and local coordination determine quality of life. Communities that adapted effectively continue to thrive, while those unable to adjust remain vulnerable to residual challenges. Ultimately, the United States emerges from the crisis as a nation that is more cautious, more resilient, and profoundly aware of its technological dependencies. The lights and networks are mostly restored, but the lessons of the blackout remain etched into national memory. The cyber attack did not just disrupt systems, it reshaped the country, its policies, its culture, and its approach to security for generations to come. The scenario we've explored is a cautionary tale, but it is grounded in reality. The vulnerabilities in America's power grid, financial systems, healthcare infrastructure, and communications networks exist today. Sophisticated cyber adversaries, both state-sponsored and independent, continuously probe these weaknesses. What we've imagined could happen tomorrow, next year, or even over the next decade. Awareness and preparation are the most vital defenses against such threats. Understanding this scenario highlights a critical truth. Modern society is intricately connected and highly efficient, but that efficiency comes with fragility. Every aspect of daily life depends on systems few of us truly see or understand. Electricity, water, healthcare, banking, transportation, and communication networks are interdependent, meaning a single attack on one system can cascade into widespread disruption. Cybersecurity is no longer an abstract technical concern, it is a national security issue with real human consequences. There are steps that individuals and communities can take to reduce vulnerability. Personal preparedness, from storing essentials like water, food, and medical supplies to maintaining offline backups of critical documents, can save lives. Local networks of support, community coordination, and knowledge sharing strengthen resilience when centralized systems fail. Learning analog skills, basic first aid, and emergency response strategies ensures people can survive even in prolonged outages. For governments and organizations, the lessons are clear: invest in resilient infrastructure, segregate operational technology from critical networks, and plan for worst-case scenarios. The post-attack reality emphasizes decentralization, redundancy, and proactive defense. It is no longer enough to react. Preparation, simulation, and continuous assessment are essential. Ultimately, the Great Cyber Blackout shows that our civilization is only as strong as the systems we rely on and the foresight we apply to protect them. While technology brings unprecedented convenience and capability, it also creates new vulnerabilities that must be acknowledged and managed. The story of a nationwide cyber attack is a stark reminder that survival in a connected world requires vigilance, awareness, and planning at every level. And if this scenario intrigues you and you want to explore more hidden risks, hypothetical disasters, and the ways society adapts under extreme pressure, subscribe and continue following our series. Understanding the fragility of our world is not just curiosity, it is a crucial step toward preparing for the unexpected. Because in today's interconnected world, the front lines are everywhere, and the line between stability and chaos can be drawn by a single line of code. For millions of people living across the central United States, an ordinary weekday begins without any hint of the danger quietly locked beneath their feet. In cities like Memphis and St. Louis, the morning routines unfold just as they always do, unaware that deep below the surface, a long slumbering fault system carries stresses that have been accumulating for more than 2 centuries. This region, stretching across the Mississippi Valley, is home to one of the most surprising and least understood seismic threats in the country, the New Madrid seismic zone. Unlike the well-known faults of the American West, the New Madrid seismic zone sits in the interior of the North American plate. It traces back to an ancient rift system that never fully tore the continent apart. That incomplete rift left behind a weakened zone in the crust, creating the conditions for powerful intraplate earthquakes. Today, this network of faults runs through portions of Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, extending for roughly 150 miles beneath some of the most heavily traveled and densely populated parts of the Midwest and South. The historic record shows just how dangerous this hidden system can be. During the winter of 1811 and 1812, a sequence of major earthquakes shook the early American frontier. Modern geologists estimate their magnitudes to have been between the high 7 range and just under 8. Reports from that era describe furniture sliding across cabins, ground waves rolling through forests, and houses collapsing in settlements located hundreds of miles from the epicenter. The shaking was strong enough to ring church bells in cities on the East Coast and rattle structures far into what is now Canada. In the centuries since those historic events, the region has remained deceptively calm, but scientific measurements show that strain is again accumulating. According to long-term assessments by the United States Geological Survey, the probability of a strong earthquake of magnitude 6 or greater in this zone during the next 5 decades is between 1/4 and 2/5. The chance of a large-scale repeat of the early 19th century sequence, while lower, still ranges between roughly 7 and 10%. Numbers that seismologists consider significant for an area with aging infrastructure and limited earthquake preparedness. The danger is amplified by the geology of the Mississippi embayment. Thick layers of sediment fill the basin, and when seismic waves pass through these soft layers, the motion becomes stronger and longer lasting. This means that even a moderate earthquake here can cause unusually widespread damage, far more extensive than what the same magnitude might produce in regions with firmer rock closer to the surface. As we begin this scenario, the question is not simply whether the new Madrid seismic zone can produce another large earthquake. It can, and history proves it. The real question is, what would happen if such an event struck a modern and highly interconnected nation? With this foundation in mind, we now move to the moment the rupture begins. Our scenario begins in the early morning hours just after 2 o'clock. The region is quiet, wrapped in the stillness that settles over the central United States long before dawn. Beneath the surface, however, a critical threshold has been reached. Along the Reelfoot Fault, one of the primary structures within the new Madrid seismic zone, stress that has accumulated for generations finally overcomes the friction holding the fault in place. The rupture begins near the town of New Madrid in southeastern Missouri. The initial break releases energy equivalent to thousands of high-yield explosives, detonating at once. Instruments would later estimate the earthquake's magnitude in the upper 7 range, comparable to the strongest events known from this fault system. In the first few seconds, a deep rumbling moves through the ground, too low in frequency for most sleeping residents to recognize. It seems to come from every direction, vibrating through homes, vehicles, and the soft sediment that fills the Mississippi basin. Then the seismic waves arrive. Unlike the sharper jolts that are common along plate boundaries in the western United States, the shaking here is dominated by slow rolling motion. The Mississippi embayment is filled with thick layers of unconsolidated soil, and these layers amplify the waves dramatically. Entire neighborhoods are hit with swells of motion that lift and drop the ground in disorienting rhythms, making it difficult to stand, walk, or even crawl to safety. As the primary waves continue to propagate outward, the true damage begins. The saturated soils in many low-lying areas lose their cohesion, triggering widespread liquefaction. Streets buckle and tilt, and the foundations of structures shift as the earth briefly behaves more like a fluid than a solid. Sections of farmland slosh and slump as underground water is forced to the surface. In some places, plumes of sand and silt erupt upward, marking the violent pressure changes occurring below. The shaking lasts for more than half a minute, long enough to topple unreinforced walls, fracture underground utilities, and destroy older structures built before modern seismic standards were considered. In communities across parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, an entire region is abruptly thrust into chaos, while most residents are still struggling to understand what is happening. As the final strong waves fade, an uneasy silence settles in. Power flickers across multiple states. Alarms blare, dogs bark. People wake to darkness, damaged buildings, and a sense that whatever has just happened is far from over. In reality, the first minute is only the beginning. In the minutes immediately following the rupture, the region enters a phase of rapid and compounding failure. The ground may have stopped shaking, but the consequences of those violent seconds begin unfolding at an overwhelming pace throughout cities and small towns located near the Mississippi River basin. Older buildings constructed of unreinforced masonry suffer significant damage. Many of these structures were never designed with seismic forces in mind, and their brittle walls split apart under the stress. Entire rows of historic storefronts collapse outward into streets now littered with fallen brick, shattered glass, and sagging power lines. Transportation corridors critical to the central United States are struck especially hard. Highways that traverse soft sediment shift unevenly, creating sudden drop-offs, fractures, and buckled pavement. The soil beneath bridge supports has been weakened by liquefaction, and this instability places enormous stress on structures spanning major rivers. Several bridges across both the Mississippi and the Ohio experienced severe deformation, with some losing sections as support columns tilt or sink into compromised ground. These failures instantly disrupt vital east-west and north-south routes, isolating communities on opposite sides of the region's waterways. And the electrical grid, which relies on a vast network of substations and transmission lines, faces cascading disruption. Many substations rest on soil that has now shifted or lost strength, causing transformers to crack or topple. High voltage lines snap under the combined strain of ground movement and structural damage to towers. As these failures spread across state lines, a large portion of the central United States is plunged into darkness. Some areas retain only brief pockets of power before automatic shutdown systems trigger to prevent further overloads. Beneath the surface, infrastructure fares no better. Water mains rupture as pipe joints are pulled apart by lateral spreading of the ground, leaving some communities without usable water and others experiencing uncontrolled flooding from broken mains. Natural gas lines, many buried decades ago without modern seismic reinforcement, break in multiple locations. In the minutes after the shaking stops, the smell of gas becomes noticeable in several neighborhoods, and small fires ignite where sparks meet leaking fuel. Communication systems falter just as urgently needed emergency responses begin. Cell towers that remain standing struggle to operate due to power loss and damaged fiber optic cables. Landline networks, so still an important part of rural communication, suffer breaks at numerous points. Residents attempting to call emergency services encounter busy signals or complete outages, leaving countless people without a way to report injuries, trapped individuals, or structural failures. Across multiple states, the combined impact becomes clear. Within less than 10 minutes, critical systems that millions depend on, transportation, electricity, water supply, gas distribution, and communication, are either severely compromised or entirely offline. And with no reliable means of contacting outside help, communities are left to confront the emerging crisis on their own as the full extent of the disaster begins to unfold. As the first hour passes, the scale of the disaster begins to become unmistakable. The central United States, a region not typically associated with earthquakes, is now grappling with conditions normally seen only in the most seismically active zones. The energy from the new Madrid rupture has traveled through the rigid continental crust with exceptional efficiency, causing strong shaking hundreds of miles from the epicenter. Cities such as Nashville, Little Rock, and Indianapolis experienced severe tremors, while residents in Chicago, Louisville, and Atlanta report buildings swaying in ways they have never felt before. Many are left stunned, questioning the reality of what they are experiencing. In the core zones, the destruction is both immediate and profound, with major roads blocked by debris and bridges compromised by subsidence and structural failures. Emergency responders are trapped, unable to reach the areas that need them most. Firefighters, police officers, and paramedics who attempt to mobilize face crumbled streets and fallen utility lines, often encountering the same hazards as civilians. Many stations themselves are damaged. Older firehouses and police facilities, built without modern seismic standards, are partially or completely destroyed, leaving first responders vulnerable and limiting their capacity to coordinate relief. Hospitals that remain standing face an influx of injured people while dealing with failing infrastructure. Backup generators provide temporary electricity, but without running water and with severed communication lines, triage and treatment are severely constrained. Medical staff struggle to navigate debris-strewn streets to reach patients, and those who do arrive find themselves working under extreme pressure, treating crush injuries, fractures, and severe trauma with limited resources. The first hour thus becomes a test of human endurance against overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, communities begin to experience secondary hazards. Flooding starts in low-lying areas, where water mains have burst and levees stressed by the shaking develop leaks. Liquefaction continues in areas of saturated soil, causing further collapse of streets and undermining standing structures. Sand blows erupt across farmland and urban areas alike, spewing sediment into streets, yards, and building foundations. Each of these hazards compounds the initial impact, further destabilizing buildings, roadways, and utilities. Communication, or the lack of it, intensifies the sense of isolation. Cellular networks are down over large areas, landlines are severed, and radio stations operate intermittently, if at all. Citizens have no reliable way to confirm the safety of family members or access instructions from emergency management agencies. In this hour, The combination of physical destruction and total communication blackout transforms what is normally a safe, quiet region into a zone of uncertainty, fear, and chaos. The human and logistical challenges that lie ahead are only beginning to take shape. As daylight breaks over the Mississippi Valley, the full scale of the disaster becomes visible. Entire neighborhoods are reduced to rubble, and the landscape itself bears the marks of the immense forces released during the earthquake. Large tracts of farmland are covered with sand blows, where liquefied soil and groundwater were expelled to the surface in miniature, volcano-like formations. Hillsides and river bluffs have collapsed in landslides, sweeping away roads, homes, and small communities. Even areas that survived the initial shaking now face new hazards as weakened slopes and fractured ground continue to shift. The Mississippi River, which has long defined the region's commerce and transportation, is now a source of catastrophe. Multiple levees were compromised or breached during the earthquake, allowing river water to inundate towns and agricultural fields. Floodwaters destroy bridges and further complicate efforts to move emergency personnel, food, or medical supplies. With major interstates impassable and rail lines twisted or submerged, the logistics of delivering aid become a daunting challenge. Airports in the region report cracked runways and damaged terminals, leaving air transport limited to a few isolated locations. The human toll is staggering. Hospitals overwhelmed by injuries face shortages of staff, supplies, and clean water. Thousands are trapped in collapsed buildings or isolated communities, with rescue operations slowed by both debris and the continued threat of aftershocks. FEMA and university projections suggest that a magnitude 7.7 event could displace over 730,000 people, forcing an unprecedented wave of internal migration and emergency shelter needs. Mental health crises emerge quickly as survivors confront trauma, loss of property, and the uncertainty of their future. Economic consequences ripple outward as well. The Mississippi River, blocked or rerouted in sections, halts barge traffic, carrying billions of dollars in goods. Local and regional businesses are destroyed or forced to close indefinitely. Repairing critical infrastructure, such as bridges, levees, and highways, will take years and cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Beyond the immediate financial impact, disrupted supply chains affect food, fuel, and manufactured goods nationwide, amplifying the disaster's reach far beyond the epicenter. In the weeks and months that follow, aftershocks continue to challenge recovery. Some exceed magnitude 6, damaging weakened structures and increasing the risk of additional collapse. Communities must rebuild almost from scratch, with engineers and emergency managers prioritizing the reconstruction of essential utilities, transportation corridors, and public safety facilities. Federal, state, and local agencies coordinate large-scale response efforts, but the scale of destruction in an area unaccustomed to major earthquakes makes progress slow and painstaking. The new Madrid seismic zone serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers posed by intraplate earthquakes. Unlike regions where seismic activity is frequent and public awareness is high, this central U.S. zone combines powerful potential energy with long intervals of quiet, producing a false sense of safety. The scenario is hypothetical, but based on scientific modeling, it demonstrates that the next rupture could challenge modern society in ways few have anticipated. The survival of communities, the resilience of infrastructure, and the capacity to respond effectively will define whether such an event becomes a tragedy of historic proportions or a testament to preparedness and adaptation. America is a nation defined by its control over water, with nearly 92,000 dams scattered across its landscape. These structures hold back rivers and reservoirs that supply cities, irrigate farms, and generate electricity. Yet the average age of these dams is over 60 years, and thousands are classified as high hazard, meaning that if they fail, the consequences would be catastrophic. Imagine for a moment that in a single instant, every one of these dams collapsed simultaneously. In the west, the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, a 6.6 million ton concrete wedge holding back Lake Mead, disintegrates. A colossal wall of water surges through Black Canyon, obliterating Laughlin and Bullhead City within minutes. Downstream, Davis and Parker dams are instantly overwhelmed, the waves carving a new path through the desert toward Yuma, Arizona. Across Arizona and Nevada, cities reliant on this water supply are cut off and millions are trapped in the chaos. In California, the Oroville Dam, the tallest in the United States at 770 feet, fails. Lake Oroville pours down the Feather River Valley as a 30-foot high, highway speed wall of water. Oroville, Yuba City, and Marysville are submerged in minutes. The Sacramento River Delta is devastated. The Central Valley, a crucial agricultural hub, transformed into a turbulent inland sea. Crops are destroyed, irrigation systems obliterated, and homes and infrastructure swept away. The Pacific Northwest faces a similar nightmare. Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River disappears, releasing the contents of Franklin D. Roosevelt Lake. The resulting flood sweeps toward Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, obliterating riverside communities and tearing through bridges, roads, and power lines. Across the Midwest, the Missouri River's massive dams, including Fort Peck in Montana, fail in succession. The river becomes an unstoppable battering ram, inundating Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri. Kansas City and St. Louis are hit with waves capable of erasing entire neighborhoods. The Mississippi River, already swollen, cannot contain the surge, compounding the destruction. In the east, thousands of older dams in densely populated areas collapse. The Tennessee Valley Authority's network of 29 hydroelectric dams becomes a chain of destruction. In Pennsylvania, New York, and New England, smaller mill dams unleash torrents that wipe out towns and reshape valleys. Within the first hour, millions of lives are lost. Entire cities are underwater, and the continent is violently transformed. The sheer scale of devastation is unlike anything in human history, and for the survivors, the nightmare has only just begun. As the floodwaters carve new paths across the continent, a second catastrophe begins, this one not made of water, but of the systems that depend on it. The United States power grid, already strained by the sudden loss of hydroelectric dams, begins to fail on a massive scale. Hydroelectric's capacity vanishes instantly, eliminating roughly 6 to 7% of the nation's electricity generation. Automated safety systems struggle to compensate, but the imbalance is too great. Within hours, entire regions are plunged into darkness, and without power, basic services grind to a halt. The loss of rivers and reservoirs creates an immediate crisis for nuclear power plants. Over 90 reactors across the country rely on continuous water flow for cooling. Emergency diesel generators engage, but without sufficient water, the pumps only circulate air and debris. Temperatures inside reactor cores begin to rise, creating the potential for meltdowns. Plants like Browns Ferry in Alabama, Cooper in Nebraska, and Palo Verde in Arizona face an unprecedented risk. In some areas, radioactive contamination begins to spread, compounding the human and environmental toll. Transportation infrastructure collapses under the weight of the catastrophe. Bridges and highways are destroyed or submerged, leaving railways twisted and unusable. Ports and shipping channels are blocked by debris from broken dams and eroded riverbanks. Food, fuel, and medical supplies cannot move, isolating communities across the country. Urban centers, already flooded or cut off, descend into chaos. Communication networks falter as well. Without power, cellular towers, data centers, and internet infrastructure fail. Emergency broadcast systems are overwhelmed, leaving citizens in the dark, not only about their surroundings, but also about official instructions or evacuation routes. Social media becomes a patchwork of fragmented reports, rumors, and pleas for help, but connectivity is inconsistent at best. Government and emergency response efforts are paralyzed. FEMA and the National Guard struggle to coordinate relief when every state is simultaneously affected. There are no safe zones to stage operations from, no intact supply lines, and no secure transportation corridors. Decisions that normally take hours must now be made in minutes, with lives hanging in the balance. By the end of the first 24 hours, America has transformed into a continent of isolated survivors. Water is gone, power is out, and communication is fractured. The immediate struggle for survival is over for some, but the long, grim fight for existence is only beginning. Millions are displaced, and the infrastructure that once held the nation together has been erased, leaving a landscape of devastation and uncertainty. Weeks turn into months, and the initial wall of water has long since moved inland, leaving a country unrecognizable. Entire river valleys have been carved anew, sediment and debris reshaping landscapes. Cities that were once vibrant hubs lie in ruins, submerged streets now replaced by mud, wreckage, and stagnant pools. Survivors face a harsh new reality. The infrastructure that supported life, power, sanitation, transport, and communication is gone, and with it the normal rhythms of society. Thirst becomes a daily struggle. The floodwaters themselves are undrinkable, contaminated with industrial chemicals, sewage, and heavy metals released from destroyed dams and water treatment facilities. Communities scavenge whatever remains. Rainwater collected from rooftops, abandoned swimming pools, or any small reservoirs that survived. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases spread rapidly, turning makeshift camps into centers of illness. Mortality rates soar, particularly among children, the elderly, and the immunocompromised. Food shortages compound the crisis. With farmland flooded, machinery destroyed, and irrigation systems obliterated, crops cannot be planted or harvested. The Midwest's grain belt, California's Central Valley, and the Mississippi Delta, all once breadbaskets, are largely unusable. Supply chains are paralyzed, making imported or stored food difficult to access. Starvation becomes a central threat, forcing mass migration as survivors follow rivers and coastlines in search of whatever edible resources remain. The social fabric phrase. Law enforcement is stretched thin, and local authorities are often powerless. Armed groups and militias emerge, controlling small caches of resources, particularly clean water. Communities become fortified enclaves where access to essentials is dictated by strength rather than law. Tribalism and barter replace governance, and conflict over territory and supplies escalates. Survival rather than cooperation becomes the primary rule of life. Environmental destruction continues. Deforested slopes destabilized by flood erosion trigger landslides, blocking rivers and burying towns. Toxic sediment settles in former lakes and reservoirs, poisoning soils and altering ecosystems. Fish and wildlife populations collapse, further disrupting the delicate balance that once supported human sustenance. The landscape itself is in constant flux, unpredictable and hostile. By the end of the first year, the United States is fundamentally altered. The scale of human displacement, disease, starvation, and environmental collapse has created a continent where the majority of people live in constant struggle. Cities are ghostly remnants, transportation is unreliable or impossible, and a new harsh form of social order based on survival and resource control has taken hold. The once interconnected nation now exists as isolated pockets of humanity, clinging to life in a radically transformed and unforgiving landscape. 2 decades after the simultaneous collapse of every dam in America, the nation is unrecognizable. Entire river systems have been permanently rerouted, valleys carved deeper, and floodplains transformed into chaotic wetlands or barren plains. The once productive agricultural heartlands remain largely unusable, forcing communities to adapt with small-scale subsistence farming along the edges of surviving arable land. Forests have reclaimed many abandoned urban and rural areas, but the regrowth is patchy, often interspersed with toxic sediment deposits left from the floods. Survivors live in decentralized, self-sufficient communities. Large cities are relics, their skyscrapers slowly collapsing into the mud, and only the coastal areas with operational desalination plants have maintained any semblance of organized governance. These fortified city-states ration water with precision, enforce strict population controls, and employ heavily armed patrols to prevent raids. Even with these measures, life is precarious. Every day is a battle against the elements and resource scarcity. Technology has regressed. Steam power, wood-fired engines, and windmills replace electricity in many settlements. Communications are mostly analog, relying on radio transmissions and courier networks. Knowledge is treasured, particularly agricultural manuals, engineering guides, and medical texts, as communities attempt to rebuild sustainable systems without modern infrastructure. Education is localized, and literacy becomes a crucial survival skill, passed down selectively within families or trusted groups. The environmental consequences are ongoing. Radioactive contamination from the nuclear plants that failed in the immediate aftermath has created exclusion zones in parts of the Southeast and Midwest. Wildlife has adapted in strange ways, with some species thriving in flooded regions, while others have disappeared entirely. Rivers, though altered, support pockets of fish and other aquatic life, but the ecosystems are fragile and highly sensitive to human activity. Cultural memory has shifted. Stories of the old America, with flowing rivers, green pastures, and plentiful water, are passed down as myths. Water is no longer taken for granted. It defines status, power, and survival. Art, music, and storytelling revolve around the scarcity and preciousness of water. commemorating the catastrophe that reshaped the continent. Despite the devastation, human resilience endures. Communities trade, form alliances, and slowly rebuild. New social structures emerge based on local resources, cooperative survival, and the protection of life-giving water sources. The continent remains dangerous and unpredictable, but life persists, shaped and hardened by 20 years of relentless struggle. As the decades pass, the landscape of America continues to evolve under the shadow of the Great Collapse. The river valleys carved by the catastrophic floods have settled into new, unpredictable courses, and many formerly fertile plains remain permanently waterlogged or covered in sediment and debris. Seasonal flooding is now a constant threat, with small communities having to relocate every few years to higher ground. Former agricultural centers have transformed into marshlands or wastelands, forcing survivors to adapt with localized food production, aquaculture in newly formed wetlands, and carefully rationed foraging. The population remains sparse and highly fragmented. Communities rely on fortified enclaves near remaining freshwater sources or coastal desalination plants, which are carefully defended against raiders. Travel between settlements is perilous. The old interstate system is largely destroyed, with only crude, hand-cleared paths and rivers used as makeshift transport routes. Caravans must navigate through unpredictable terrain, dealing with natural hazards and hostile groups that control critical resources. Economic and social systems are entirely decentralized. Barter has replaced currency, with water, food, and fuel serving as the primary forms of trade. Communities that manage to cultivate medicinal plants, repair old machinery, or harness renewable energy gain significant influence over their neighbors. Knowledge of survival skills, water purification techniques, and environmental stewardship has become the most valuable currency, passed carefully from one generation to the next. The ecological consequences of the collapse remain profound. Forests and wetlands have begun to reclaim abandoned farmland and urban areas, but toxic sediment from destroyed dams continues to pollute soil and water. Many species of fish and wildlife have adapted to the new conditions, while others have vanished entirely. The environmental balance is fragile, and small mistakes such as overfishing or mismanaged irrigation can have catastrophic ripple effects across local ecosystems. Technology has been adapted for a low-resource world. Steam engines, wind turbines, and small-scale solar setups power critical infrastructure, while old knowledge from engineering, medicine, and agriculture guides reconstruction efforts. Communities are inventive, using salvaged materials to build water storage systems, irrigation channels, and protective barriers against seasonal floods. Cultural memory is both a guide and a warning. Stories of the lost cities, the power of the dams, and the floods themselves are told as cautionary tales. Rituals and festivals often center on water, celebrating survival and commemorating the ancestors who endured the initial collapse. Education focuses on practical survival, resource management, and preserving knowledge of the old world, ensuring that each new generation can navigate a continent forever changed by the simultaneous failure of nearly 92,000 dams. Centuries after the simultaneous collapse of every dam in America, the continent has been reshaped almost beyond recognition. The old nation exists now only in memory, recorded in tattered books and the oral histories of scattered communities. Former coastlines have been redrawn by silt and sediment, river courses permanently altered by the violent surges of water, and vast inland seas have replaced fertile valleys. Many regions once dense with human settlement are now forests, marshes, or barren plains, where wildlife has either adapted or vanished entirely. The remnants of humanity live in isolated, self-sufficient communities. Knowledge of agriculture, water management, and basic engineering is the lifeblood of society. Wells, cisterns, and carefully maintained springs are fiercely protected, and water scarcity dictates almost every aspect of life. Children grow up learning to read weather patterns, predict floods, and purify water, ensuring the survival of each enclave. Civilization has reverted to a decentralized agrarian state, yet it is a world rich with ingenuity and resilience. Despite the hardship, ecosystems are recovering in unexpected ways. Wetlands formed by breached dams have become havens for birds and fish, while forests reclaim abandoned towns. Predatory and herbivorous species flourish in the absence of human encroachment. Some areas, however, remain permanently uninhabitable due to lingering toxic sediments and the aftermath of nuclear and industrial disasters triggered in the collapse. Humans must navigate around these dead zones using knowledge of the terrain and resource distribution to survive. Trade and communication are slow but crucial. Caravans transport food, water, and tools between communities, and alliances are formed based on mutual survival rather than political borders. Festivals and storytelling keep cultural identity alive, commemorating the time before the dams and teaching lessons about the fragility of human control over nature. Water is no longer taken for granted. It is revered, rationed, and embedded into every aspect of society. The collapse serves as a permanent reminder of humanity's dependence on infrastructure. Once symbols of engineering prowess, the dams are now ghostly relics. Their ruins, monuments to both ingenuity and hubris. The simultaneous failure of nearly 92,000 dams did not just destroy cities and kill millions. It rewrote the rules of life on the continent. Humanity survived, but the Earth they inherited is a planet governed by water itself. In the end, the story of America's dams is both a warning and a testament. It shows how civilization can be built and lost in the blink of an eye, and how survival depends on adaptability, knowledge, and respect for the forces of nature. Though the continent is unrecognizable, life persists. In the quiet forests along the reclaimed rivers, and within the fortified enclaves, humans continue to endure. A resilient species forever shaped by the great water that once defined and then destroyed their world. Imagine a calm evening in a sprawling city. Glass towers glow with warm lights, traffic hums below, and everything feels solid, stable, and predictable. Now picture that same skyline, with a single impossible change, an enormous circle of empty space where a towering building stood just moments before. No explosion, no fire. Just a silent void where the ground opened without warning. It feels like a scene from a big-budget disaster film, but the unsettling question is whether nature could really pull this off. The idea of a skyscraper vanishing into the earth overnight sounds absurd, but the truth is that our planet's surface is not as still as it seems. Beneath city streets, offices, and subway lines, geological processes are constantly reshaping the ground, sometimes quietly and sometimes violently. To understand whether this nightmare scenario could ever be real, we have to start with how the Earth creates sinkholes in the first place. A sinkhole is a natural depression or sudden collapse of the ground surface, and it forms when underground material is removed or destabilized. These collapses don't strike randomly, they occur most often in what geologists call karst regions, areas where the underlying bedrock, often limestone, dolomite, or gypsum, dissolves gradually in water. When rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it becomes slightly acidic. Over long periods, that weak acid seeps into the ground and begins dissolving the rock below. While this chemical reaction is extremely slow, it steadily hollows out passages, chambers, and networks of underground voids. On the surface, the landscape may look perfectly normal, even though deep beneath it, empty spaces are quietly growing. There are two main ways these hollow spaces reveal themselves. Sometimes the surface slowly sinks as underground cavities expand, creating gentle depressions. More dramatically, a sudden collapse can occur when the roof of an underground void becomes too thin to support the weight above it. This is what geologists refer to as a cover collapse sinkhole. These collapses can happen quickly, sometimes within hours, and the result can be a steep, circular hole that appears with frightening speed. Even more troubling, human activity can make these collapses more likely. Excessive groundwater pumping, leaking drainage pipes, poorly managed stormwater systems, and construction vibrations can destabilize the upper layers of soil and accelerate the natural process. Around the world, sinkholes have swallowed cars, roads, and homes in a matter of minutes. In some cities, they have consumed entire sections of streets. These events remind us that the Earth's surface is not a solid shell, but a thin layer resting on top of dynamic, dissolving rock. Still, while the destructive power of sinkholes is undeniable, the question remains, could any of these natural processes possibly scale up to something large enough to take down a modern skyscraper? Next, we will look at what it actually takes to hold a skyscraper upright, and what conditions would be required for the ground below one to collapse completely. To understand whether a sinkhole could ever take down a skyscraper, we need to look beneath the surface, literally. A modern high-rise may appear delicate from a distance, all shimmering glass and narrow lines, but everything about its design is built around one goal: making sure it stays firmly attached to the earth. The height you see above ground is only part of the story. The real strength of a skyscraper lies in what anchors it deep below street level. Engineers spend years studying the geology of a building site because a tall structure cannot rely on surface soil alone. That loose upper layer shifts with moisture, compacts under weight, and is far too unstable to support hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and concrete. Before construction even begins, engineers conduct detailed geotechnical investigations to understand every layer beneath the future tower. They drill deep boreholes to extract core samples and use seismic testing to map underground conditions. These studies reveal whether strong bedrock is close to the surface or buried far below. In cities built on exceptionally tough rock, like the schist beneath Manhattan, skyscrapers can anchor directly into the solid formation. This natural foundation allows engineers to transfer the immense weight of the building into rock that has been stable for millions of years. In places where strong bedrock lies deeper, engineers rely on deep foundation systems. One common method uses piles, long columns made of concrete or steel, driven far into the ground until they reach a layer capable of supporting massive loads. Some of the world's tallest buildings sit on foundation piles that extend tens of meters below the surface. These piles do not depend on loose soil to hold them in place. Instead, they carry the building's weight downward until it reaches firm, compressed ground or bedrock. This creates a foundation system that behaves like an array of incredibly strong legs supporting the structure. Many skyscrapers also include massive reinforced concrete mats at their base. These mats spread the building's weight more evenly and improve stability in areas where soil layers vary in strength. Combined with deep piles or caissons, these mats help ensure that no single weak layer can undermine the entire structure. Builders also design foundations with safety factors well beyond the building's normal load to ensure that seasonal changes, groundwater fluctuations, or minor soil shifts cannot compromise the structure. Because of this complex engineering, a skyscraper is not simply resting on the earth, it is locked into it. For a sinkhole to threaten a building of this scale, the collapse would need to be far larger and deeper than anything typically seen in urban environments. It would have to destroy not only the surface layers, but also the stable material deep below that the foundation depends on. In the next part, we will examine what kind of extreme conditions would be required for such a collapse to unfold. A major contributor is the slow decay of underground infrastructure. Old water mains, storm drains, and sewer lines can leak for years, washing away soil grain by grain. In large cities, some pipes are more than 100 years old, and even minor cracks can create steady erosion cavities that expand unnoticed. Engineers call this process piping, and it can hollow out huge underground voids long before surface cracks ever appear. Another issue comes from the weight of the city itself. Skyscrapers, elevated highways, subway tunnels, and heavy traffic all put enormous pressure on the ground. If the soil beneath is already weakened by natural dissolution or quiet water flow, that pressure can accelerate subsurface collapse. Even well-designed foundations can become stressed when the geology changes unexpectedly. Construction activity also plays a role. Deep excavation for basements, parking garages, and utility tunnels can alter groundwater levels. When groundwater drops, the support it once provided to the soil disappears. In regions with soluble rock, losing that water balance allows underground cavities to grow faster. In other cases, vibrations from construction equipment can destabilize loose or water-softened soil, encouraging the ground to shift. Modern cities often hide their geological past. A skyscraper might be built over an old filled-in quarry, an abandoned drainage channel, or soil that was artificially compacted decades earlier. These materials can behave unpredictably over long periods of time. What looks stable at the surface may not reflect what is happening deep below. Climate shifts add another layer of risk. Periods of heavy rainfall can overwhelm drainage systems, increasing the water pressure underground. When too much water moves through fractured rock or loose fill, it can trigger sudden subsurface erosion. Meanwhile, long dry spells can shrink certain soils, especially clay-rich layers, creating gaps around foundations that weaken surface support. All of these factors combine to create a complex and often invisible threat. Cities rarely fail from a single cause. Sinkhole disasters usually happen when multiple small vulnerabilities line up at the worst possible moment. And because most of the danger is hidden beneath pavement and concrete, early warning signs are easy to miss. Modern sinkhole detection begins with ground-penetrating radar. This technology sends radio waves into the earth and measures how they bounce back. When engineers see irregular reflections, it can indicate underground voids, weakened soil, or pockets of dissolved rock. Ground-penetrating radar is especially useful in urban environments because it can scan paved surfaces without excavation. Another essential tool is microgravity surveying. The concept is simple. Empty spaces underground have slightly lower gravitational pull than solid ground. When sensors detect subtle gravity changes, analysts can map where underground cavities might be forming. This method is valuable for locating voids beneath foundations, roadways, and utility corridors. LiDAR scanning is also becoming more common in cities. By bouncing laser pulses off the ground from aircraft or drones, LiDAR can detect even tiny changes in elevation. If a surface begins to sag by a fraction of an inch, it may signal that the soil below is shifting or settling unevenly. These early depressions often develop long before a sinkhole becomes visible. Acoustic monitoring adds another layer of protection. Sensitive instruments can pick up faint cracking, shifting, or moving soil beneath structures. Changes in natural underground vibrations, known as seismic noise, help engineers identify when the ground is loosening or collapsing internally. This approach works continuously, providing early warnings without interrupting city activity. Soil sampling also plays an important role. Engineers drill narrow boreholes to study the density, moisture content, and mineral composition of the ground. In regions with limestone, gypsum, or salt deposits, these samples reveal whether dissolution or water infiltration is increasing. In urban areas, sampling helps verify whether old fill material is compacting or breaking down with age. Some cities use groundwater monitoring wells to watch for sudden water level changes. A rising water table can force soil apart, while a rapidly dropping one can remove essential buoyancy that supports underground cavities. These shifts often occur weeks or months before ground failure becomes visible at the surface. Remote sensing satellites add long-range oversight. Using a technique called interferometric synthetic aperture radar, satellites can track millimeter-level land movement over time. When the ground begins to sink slowly, even at a pace too small for a person to notice, these measurements provide critical warning signs. By combining all these technologies, engineers create a layered defense system. No single method is perfect, but together they dramatically improve the chances of identifying dangerous subsurface changes before a sudden collapse occurs. The idea of a skyscraper disappearing into the earth in a single night is dramatic, but the physics behind these structures makes that outcome extremely unlikely. Modern high-rise buildings are anchored by deep foundation systems, such as drilled shafts and reinforced concrete piles that extend many stories into stable ground layers. These foundations distribute weight across multiple contact points, meaning a failure at one location rarely causes the entire building to fall suddenly. Documented large sinkholes, including those in regions with active karst terrain, typically develop in stages. The collapse often begins with a subterranean cavity that enlarges gradually as water dissolves underlying rock. Even when a final collapse is abrupt, the surface usually shows early warning signs such as cracking pavement, tilted utility poles, and localized subsidence. Skyscrapers with active monitoring systems would detect these shifts long before catastrophic failure. For a high-rise to fall into a sinkhole in a single night, an extreme set of conditions would need to occur simultaneously. The ground would have to contain a massive hidden void directly beneath the building. The supporting bedrock would need to fail without warning, and the building's foundations would need to lose structural support at nearly every anchor point at once. There are no recorded cases of all these factors aligning beneath a modern skyscraper. More realistically, partial foundation loss could cause structural distress rather than sudden disappearance. A building might lean, fracture, or experience settlement that forces evacuation, but engineers could reinforce or stabilize the site before complete collapse occurred. In urban settings, rapid emergency response and ground stabilization protocols reduce the likelihood of uncontrolled failure. If a worst-case sinkhole opened under part of a skyscraper, the collapse would be uneven. One section might drop while the rest remained intact, creating a visible tilt or break rather than a clean vertical plunge. Rescue agencies would intervene immediately, and structural engineers would assess whether the remaining portions could be stabilized or required demolition. While overnight total collapse remains highly improbable, smaller sinkholes near skyscrapers can still cause serious damage. Roads, sidewalks, and nearby low-rise buildings are more vulnerable because they rely on shallower foundations. Many cities monitor past subsidence zones to prevent development on unstable terrain. The real risk lies not in skyscrapers being swallowed whole, but in the gradual weakening of urban ground caused by leaks, aging infrastructure, and changing water tables. Continuous monitoring, routine inspections, and strict geological surveys remain the most reliable way to prevent disaster. The moment the power vanishes, silence falls heavier than darkness itself. The steady hum of civilization and the buzz of neon signs, the rhythm of traffic lights, the endless whirl of refrigeration and air conditioning disappears. For over 400 million people, life is instantly unrecognizable. In Europe's great capitals like Paris, Berlin, and Rome, chaos begins within minutes. Subways grind to a halt deep underground, leaving thousands trapped in pitch-black tunnels with no way to climb out. Traffic lights go dead, transforming intersections into battlegrounds of horns and screeching brakes as cars collide in confusion. Elevators stop between floors, instantly turning into steel cages. Communication collapses just as quickly. Mobile towers and internet servers depend on continuous electricity, and while a handful of emergency systems remain for governments and militaries, ordinary citizens are cut off. Social media, news updates, and emergency numbers all vanish. People discover for the first time in generations what it means to be truly isolated, unable to reach family or even know what has happened beyond their street. Hospitals, among the most critical institutions, shift to crisis mode within seconds. Ventilators, heart monitors, and surgical lights cut out before backup generators roar to life. But these generators run on finite diesel supplies, often only enough for a few days. Doctors and nurses must make rapid decisions, rationing power and equipment, while simultaneously managing patients terrified by the sudden blackout. Airports become scenes of chaos as radar systems, runway lights, and air traffic control fail. While some planes already in the air can divert or continue under backup protocols, departures and landings across Europe halt abruptly. Thousands of passengers are stranded in terminals, now lit only by emergency lights, with no information about what has gone wrong. By the end of the first hour, the blackout is no longer just a technical failure. It is a collapse of trust in the very systems that define modern life. What began as silence has already become fear, and for the hundreds of millions now stranded in darkness, this is only the beginning. As the first day without power unfolds, the scale of the catastrophe becomes undeniable. What was at first confusion now transforms into a fight for basic survival. Water systems are among the earliest to fail. Electric pumps that maintain pressure in municipal supplies go silent, and high-rise apartments are the first to lose running water. Within hours, taps across entire cities begin to run dry. Treatment plants no longer functioning allow untreated water to seep into the system. Contamination risk rises quickly, threatening outbreaks of gastrointestinal disease. Food security unravels just as fast. Refrigeration in homes, restaurants, and grocery stores fails, leaving perishables to spoil. Supermarket supply chains grind to a halt, with trucks unable to refuel and electronic payment systems useless. By the afternoon, shelves are stripped of bottled water, canned food, and medical essentials. Cash becomes the only reliable form of exchange, but even that quickly loses value when goods cannot be replenished. Public order is strained as desperation grows. With police radios down and emergency services overwhelmed, law enforcement response times stretch to hours, if not longer. Opportunistic crime rises, and many citizens begin to guard what resources they have. The sudden disappearance of surveillance systems, alarms, and street lighting creates opportunities for theft and violence under cover of night. Transportation paralysis deepens. Electric rail networks, which carry millions of passengers across Europe daily, remain frozen. Roads clog with vehicles as fuel stations shut down without power to operate pumps. Air travel, already disrupted in the first hour, halts completely, severing cross-border mobility. What was once a connected continent fractures into isolated pockets, with movement restricted to those who can walk or cycle. Healthcare faces mounting pressure. Backup generators, though still running, must be rationed to the most critical areas, such as intensive care units and emergency wards. Non-urgent treatments are canceled outright. Pharmacies cannot restock, and hospitals begin running low on vital supplies such as insulin, antibiotics, and blood for transfusions. Patients requiring continuous care outside hospitals, such as those dependent on home dialysis or oxygen machines, are left in life-threatening conditions. As night falls, a darkness not seen in centuries cloaks Europe. With no streetlights, no house lights, and no glow of cities on the horizon, the continent sinks into an unsettling silence. Fires, candles, and flashlights become the only sources of illumination. For many, fear of the dark becomes very real, as communities brace themselves for an uncertain second day. By the end of 24 hours, Europe is no longer functioning as a modern society. The systems that underpin daily life, water, food, healthcare, transportation, and security, are cracking apart. For the hundreds of millions living through it, the first day has already become the longest day of their lives. By the third day without power, Europe has crossed into a true survival crisis. What began as confusion and disruption has now escalated into widespread desperation. Water scarcity becomes the most immediate and deadly threat, with municipal pumps still offline. Reservoirs and household storage are drained. People turn to rivers, ponds, and fountains, but without treatment plants operating. These sources carry dangerous pathogens. Diseases like cholera and dysentery, which modern Europe had nearly eliminated, threaten to return in force. Dehydration alone begins to claim lives, particularly among children, the elderly, and those with existing health conditions. Food shortages worsen dramatically. Supermarkets and warehouses have already been emptied, and without refrigeration, remaining supplies rot. Rural communities may still access farms and stored grains, but transporting food into cities is nearly impossible. Fuel pumps remain useless, and trucks sit idle, leaving millions of urban residents stranded without reliable access to nutrition. Malnutrition begins to set in, especially for those unable to secure high-calorie foods. Social cohesion frays under the weight of scarcity. While some neighborhoods form local networks to share resources, others collapse into conflict. In larger cities, organized gangs take advantage of the absence of law enforcement, controlling access to food and water. Rural communities, once seen as safe havens, grow suspicious of outsiders as waves of urban refugees begin to arrive. Small towns and villages, with their limited supplies, cannot handle the sudden influx, creating flashpoints of tension. Governments and emergency authorities struggle to assert control. Without mass communication systems, even simple instructions cannot reliably reach the public. Radios, once a fallback in emergencies, are silent without electricity to transmit or recharge batteries. Military forces, though capable of limited operations on backup systems, cannot enforce order across an entire continent. Declaring martial law may be possible, but enforcing it is not. Infrastructure risks compound the crisis. Oil refineries, chemical plants, and industrial facilities were designed with power-dependent safety systems. As emergency generators burn through fuel reserves, these sites require constant manual oversight to prevent accidents. Meanwhile, nuclear power stations, though built with multiple redundant safeguards, still demand steady cooling for their reactor cores. Engineers work tirelessly with backup systems and improvised methods, but the longer the blackout persists, the greater the danger of a regional nuclear incident. By the 72-hour mark, survival is no longer just about enduring inconvenience. It is about facing a continent-wide collapse of health, food, security, and governance. For the first time in modern history, millions of Europeans experience life without the foundation of electricity, and the fragile balance of modern civilization is on the edge of breaking. After 1 week without electricity, Europe no longer resembles the modern world. Cities that once pulsed with energy and commerce are now silent and perilous places. The absence of sanitation, refrigeration, and reliable healthcare creates conditions ripe for outbreaks of illness. Diseases like typhoid, influenza, and gastrointestinal infections spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters and among families forced to drink unsafe water. Medical supplies dwindle, and without functioning supply chains, hospitals cannot restock critical medicines. The migration out of urban centers accelerates. Millions abandon darkened cities, forming long columns of people on highways and rural roads. Trains remain frozen on dead tracks, and airports stay shuttered, leaving walking as the primary option. Villages and small towns, unprepared for such mass arrivals, begin to close themselves off, sometimes with improvised barricades. The countryside sees growing tension as desperate migrants clash with locals defending their limited food and clean water. Europe's position in the global economy collapses. Seaports, normally responsible for handling millions of containers each week, lie idle with cranes frozen in place. Cargo ships carrying food, fuel, and essential goods drift offshore with nowhere to unload. International markets react violently, triggering recessions around the world. The absence of Europe, one of the largest trading blocs, throws industries into chaos from Asia to the Americas. Even countries with power begin to feel shortages of key European-made products, from pharmaceuticals to automotive parts. Attempts to restore electricity prove painfully complex. Restarting a power grid after a complete collapse is known as a black start. It requires starting individual power plants using isolated small generators, then carefully linking them together. Normally, countries depend on neighboring grids to supply this initial kickstart. But with all of Europe dark, no such assistance exists. Engineers must attempt to bring power stations online, one by one, creating isolated islands of electricity. This is a task that demands coordination, but communication networks remain mostly down, making synchronization a monumental challenge. Meanwhile, the cultural impact begins to surface. In the absence of television, internet, and most radio, people return to older forms of interaction. Storytelling, handwritten notes, and physical community gatherings become the primary means of sharing information. Libraries, often overlooked in the digital age, become gathering points as people seek knowledge on survival, agriculture, and medicine. The pace of life slows dramatically, with daylight hours dictating all activity. For the first time in centuries, European life resembles something closer to the pre-industrial age. By the end of the first week, survival is no longer just about waiting for the power to come back. For many, it has become about adapting to a world where the return of electricity is not guaranteed. Europe stands on the edge of a new era, one where modern conveniences are gone, and the continent must relearn how to live without the very system that once defined it. As weeks turn into months, the blackout reshapes Europe in profound ways. Survival depends on adaptability, resourcefulness, and community cooperation. Families who relied heavily on digital conveniences struggle the most, while those with access to traditional skills, such as farming, carpentry, and basic medical care, find themselves in positions of strength. Rural areas, though strained by refugees, often fare better than major cities as they still retain some ability to grow food and access clean water. Governments across Europe attempt to re-establish order, but without a functioning power grid, their ability to govern is fractured. Emergency assemblies are held in local town halls, often lit by candles or improvised lamps, as leaders try to communicate with scattered populations. Military forces, stretched thin, shift focus from defense to humanitarian roles, distributing remaining fuel, securing food depots, and trying to maintain fragile peace. Yet the sheer scale of the disaster makes centralized control nearly impossible. Local leadership becomes far more influential than national parliaments or ministries. The threat of nuclear power plant failures remains a shadow over the continent, while engineers manage to prevent immediate catastrophes through manual cooling methods and carefully rationed fuel. The long-term safety of dozens of reactors remains in question. Maintaining them without stable electricity requires constant human effort, and every delay in restoring grid power keeps the risk alive. International teams from Africa, the Americas, and Asia offer assistance, but transportation bottlenecks limit how quickly help can arrive. Economically, the continent faces collapse. The European Union, long a symbol of unity, fragments under the pressure. Countries previously tied together by shared markets and currency begin prioritizing their own survival, breaking long-standing agreements. With ports closed and factories idle, unemployment reaches levels unseen in modern history. International trade partners face shortages of key exports, from industrial chemicals to luxury goods, deepening the global crisis. What began as a regional blackout now shakes the entire world economy. On the cultural front, the absence of electricity transforms daily life. Nights are dominated by darkness, forcing people back into rhythms dictated by sunrise and sunset. Cities once alive with nightlife and constant motion become hushed and still after dusk. Communities rely on bartering systems, exchanging skills, food, and tools in place of collapsed financial networks. Schools, when they manage to reopen, use chalkboards and paper instead of computers, teaching survival skills alongside traditional lessons. Gradually, small successes emerge. A handful of engineers manage to restart isolated hydroelectric plants in mountainous regions, providing faint glimmers of light in nearby towns. These islands of power become lifelines, drawing displaced families and becoming centers of rebuilding. But progress is slow. And for much of the continent, electricity remains a distant dream. For millions, the blackout defines a generational shift, one that forces people to reconsider what progress means when the most advanced systems can fail so completely. The final question lingers. Could Europe recover fully from such a catastrophe? History shows resilience in the face of disaster, from wars to pandemics, but the timescale is uncertain. Some experts suggest that with coordinated international aid and functioning infrastructure, a full restoration might take months. Others warn it could take years before Europe regains anything resembling its former technological society. What is certain is that the blackout leaves a permanent scar. It reveals just how fragile the foundation of modern life truly is. Europe, once a beacon of progress and connection, now serves as a stark reminder that civilization rests on a fragile grid of wires and circuits. When that grid fails, so too does the world we thought unshakable. Day 1 begins not with chaos, but with silence. The morning sprinklers do not turn on. The dishwasher does not start. The shower sputters and coughs before running dry. You turn the tap once, then again harder, but no water comes out. Across the country, in apartments, houses, and offices, millions of people are discovering the exact same thing. From New York City to Iowa's farmlands to the suburbs of California, every faucet and every well has gone dry. At first, the reaction is confusion. Most people assume it is a local outage, maybe a burst pipe or a broken main. Calls pour into water departments, but the lines are jammed or disconnected. On social media, people start sharing updates. Hashtags trend in New York and Los Angeles, and disbelief spreads when it becomes clear this is not just a citywide issue, it is everywhere. Reports show empty canyons where the Colorado River should be. The Mississippi has turned into a trickle of mud. Even the Great Lakes, which normally hold about 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water, appear as barren craters. By the third hour, panic begins. Supermarkets are raided as bottled water flies off the shelves. People grab anything liquid they can, juice, soda, even milk. Small fights break out in the aisles, and some stores lock their doors to stop the chaos. The price of a single bottle of water jumps from $1 to $50 or even $100, a cost only a few can pay. For everyone else, thirst has already become a looming threat. By the 8th hour, America's systems start to fail. A fire in a Chicago restaurant spreads uncontrollably because hydrants are dry, and firefighters only have the water in their trucks. In Dallas, a life-saving surgery is canceled because sterilization equipment cannot be used. Hospitals, once safe havens, suddenly turn into dangerous places where sanitation is impossible. Then the power grid begins to collapse. Hydroelectric dams stop producing electricity almost immediately. Nuclear and fossil fuel plants, which need billions of gallons of water each day to cool their reactors and systems, shut down one by one. By the 15th hour, large parts of the country are without power, leaving cities in darkness. That night, the president declares a national emergency. FEMA and the National Guard are deployed, but the mission is impossible. How do you distribute a resource that no longer exists? Any hidden reserves are secured by the military, but for the public, there is nothing to give. In the blacked out cities, riots take over the streets. Looting spreads beyond supermarkets to pharmacies and hardware stores. Gunfire echoes in the night, and emergency vehicles are overwhelmed. By the end of the first 24 hours, the United States has fallen into chaos. Order has already collapsed, and this is only the beginning. Day 2 dawns with a nation already on edge. The confusion of the first day has turned into raw fear as thirst begins to take hold. Headaches, dizziness, and dry mouths spread across the country. People line up outside closed grocery stores, desperate for even a single bottle of water. Families begin rationing what little they found the day before, while many have nothing left at all. You can go weeks without food, but only a few days without water. The countdown has already started. By the third day, the crisis expands beyond individuals and households. Farms collapse almost instantly. Livestock begin dying in staggering numbers, from cattle in Texas to chickens in Arkansas and hogs in North Carolina. Entire herds are found lying lifeless in the fields, victims of a thirst they cannot escape. The crops fare no better. Corn in Iowa and wheat in Kansas shrivel to dust. America's breadbasket, once the engine of global food exports, is reduced to barren fields within 72 hours. This agricultural collapse reveals the hidden truth about modern consumption. Everything has a water cost. A pound of beef requires thousands of gallons to produce. Even a single cotton t-shirt represents hundreds of gallons. Without water, production of food and goods ends overnight. It's not just farming that has stopped, it is the entire foundation of the economy. By the fourth day, the financial markets implode. The New York Stock Exchange closes its doors, unable to operate in a country where industry itself no longer functions. Manufacturing halts as car factories, steel plants, and chemical facilities all go silent without cooling water. High-tech industries like semiconductor plants collapse immediately, their delicate processes destroyed without precise water supplies. The value of the American dollar plunges on the global stage, sparking panic far beyond US borders. As the first week progresses, the public health crisis becomes impossible to ignore. With sewage systems broken and trash piling up, outbreaks of disease begin spreading. Cholera emerges in southern cities where sanitation is already fragile. Dysentery sweeps through crowded shelters where families have fled. Hospitals, already powerless without sterilization, become breeding grounds for infection. Tens of thousands fall sick and there is no treatment. By the seventh day, America is unrecognizable. Neighborhoods turn into barricaded strongholds as people guard whatever supplies they have left. Streets are patrolled by desperate groups searching for liquid of any kind. The National Guard is stretched beyond breaking, no longer able to provide aid but only containment. The social fabric of the nation tears apart in a single week. America has become a land of survival, ruled not by law but by thirst. By the third week, desperation turns into migration. Millions leave their homes in the cities and towns, setting out on foot toward places they believe might still hold water. The highways, once filled with cars, are now crowded with endless streams of people walking. They carry backpacks, push shopping carts, or drag suitcases, but what they carry is far less important than what they are searching for. The dream is simple: reach the oceans or the Great Lakes where water once seemed endless. But the journey itself becomes a death march. With no food and no water along the way, entire families collapse on the hot pavement. The elderly and the young are the first to fall, leaving behind haunting trails of abandoned belongings on the road. The migration becomes one of the largest humanitarian crises in history, a mass movement of people with almost nowhere to go and nothing to find when they arrive. Inside hidden government facilities, desperate plans take shape. From bunkers deep underground, officials order the construction of desalination plants along the coasts, guarded by soldiers and declared critical to survival. The hope is to turn seawater into fresh water quickly enough to sustain millions. But desalination requires massive amounts of power, and with most of the grid already dark, progress is agonizingly slow. Even if a plant is completed, it produces only a fraction of the water Americans once used daily. In this vacuum of power, a new kind of ruler rises, the water barons. These are not elected officials, but individuals or groups who seized whatever reserves remained. A rancher with a secret well, a gang that took over a bottling warehouse, or a wealthy family that stockpiled underground tanks. All of them now hold absolute authority over anyone desperate enough to trade for a drink. In this new America, water has replaced money as the only true currency. The environment itself begins to unravel. With rivers gone and lakes reduced to dust, natural weather cycles break down. Clouds no longer form, and rain becomes a memory. Across the West, dry forests ignite into massive wildfires that rage unchecked. Wildlife vanishes, ecosystems collapse, and entire regions of the country are transformed into lifeless deserts. By the end of the month, the nation has fractured into a patchwork of isolated groups, fortified towns, wandering bands, and coastal enclaves under martial law. Communication has broken down, and there is no longer a sense of a single United States. What once was a modern superpower has, in just 30 days, collapsed into a primitive struggle for survival. A full year passes, and what remains of America barely resembles the country it once was. The population has plummeted, with tens of millions gone to thirst, disease, or starvation. What began as chaos has hardened into a brutal new normal. Survival is no longer about temporary fixes or waiting for rescue. It's about adapting to a world where water is rarer than gold. The coasts become the last bastions of organized life. Around a handful of desalination plants, walled cities rise. Places like San Diego and Charleston turn into fortress states, run under strict military law. Life inside is regimented to the milliliter. Every drop of water is measured and accounted for, rationed with absolute precision. Breaking the water laws is the gravest crime, punished not with prison but with exile into the wastelands. These coastal enclaves are both havens and prisons, where survival comes at the cost of freedom. Outside these guarded cities, the interior has become the drylands. Vast regions from the Great Plains to the Midwest are now lawless deserts, littered with the skeletons of once great cities. Chicago, St. Louis, and countless others stand as silent ruins. The their skyscrapers rising above sand-filled streets. Nomadic bands roam these territories, surviving off scavenged cans of food and the faint hope of stumbling across a hidden spring. For them, the world before water vanished is already fading into myth. Inside the fortress cities, scientists labored desperately on long-shot solutions. They drilled deep into the Earth's crust, searching for untouched aquifers hidden miles below. Others experiment with pulling moisture directly from the air, building towering atmospheric water generators. Progress is painfully slow, and resources are thin, but research continues because hope is the only thing left to cling to. A generation of children grows up in this world, knowing nothing of rivers, lakes, or rainfall. To them, stories of swimming pools, water parks, and summer rainstorms sound like fairy tales. They live in a world where water doesn't fall freely from the sky. It is manufactured, guarded, and rationed like treasure. Their reality is shaped by scarcity, and their imaginations cannot even picture abundance. 1 year after the taps went dry, America exists in fragments, a collection of fortress states on the edges of a continent surrounded by deserts where millions struggle to survive. The global order has shifted, and the once dominant superpower has been reduced to a land haunted by thirst. By the 5th year of the crisis, the United States is unrecognizable. The old federal government is gone, fractured under the weight of collapse. What remains is a patchwork of regional powers, each defined by its access, or lack of access, to water. The once seamless idea of a united nation has broken into competing territories. The coastal fortress states thrive behind their walls, their survival owed to desalination and strict control. They trade carefully with international allies, offering technology and military protection in exchange for food and supplies. But their reach ends at the wastelands, where the majority of Americans still suffer. Between the fortified cities and the lawless dry lands lies a no-man's land patrolled by militias, smugglers, and raiders who sell stolen water for impossible prices. In the dry lands, a harsh new culture emerges. Communities that survive are not built around wealth or ideology, but around access to wells, aquifers, or captured rainfall. These water sources are defended with ferocity, and disputes are settled with violence more often than words. Former highways have become migration routes, where desperate caravans wander in search of rumored springs that rarely exist. The international stage shifts dramatically. Nations with abundant water, like Canada, Brazil, and parts of Africa, rise in influence. Shipments of bottled water cross oceans, but they reach only a privileged few. For the rest of the American population, outside aid is a whisper, too little to change the reality of mass thirst. The once global superpower has become a dependent client, reliant on the charity and conditions of others. Social life erodes further. Education collapses in most regions, replaced by survival training. Schools are abandoned, hospitals stripped for supplies, and the arts reduced to faint memories. People trade not in money, but in water, food, and information. A gallon of clean water is worth more than gold ever was, and the very idea of luxury has been rewritten. By now, the population is hardened, but exhaustion grows. For those who remember the time before, the thirst is not just physical, it is emotional. The memory of flowing rivers, summer rains, and cool glasses of water haunts them more than the dryness itself. For the young, there is no memory of that world. Their America is dust, steel walls, and the endless search for a drink. 5 years into the waterless future, the nation is split between the few who control water and the many who are left to wander. It is not only a struggle for survival, it is the slow rewriting of what it means to be American. A decade into this relentless crisis, the United States has transformed into a continent of extremes. The coastal fortress states remain the last bastions of organized civilization. Inside their walls, life is highly regimented. Every drop of water is tracked, rationed, and recycled. People move in shifts to conserve energy and reduce evaporation, and strict penalties are enforced for any misuse. Outside, the dry lands stretch endlessly, a vast expanse of dust, ruins, and the skeletal remains of cities that once thrived. By now, the natural environment has been irrevocably altered. Forests have been reduced to tinder, rivers are mere cracked beds, and wetlands have disappeared completely. Wildlife has either vanished or adapted into small, scattered pockets near the few remaining water sources. Birds no longer migrate in their millions, and fish are extinct in most American rivers. The ecosystem has collapsed, leaving a silent, barren landscape that mirrors the struggle of humanity itself. Communities in the drylands have learned to survive in primitive ways. Rainwater collection, digging for hidden aquifers, and capturing morning dew are daily necessities. Nomadic tribes traverse the continent in search of these scarce resources, often encountering hostile groups that guard water with lethal efficiency. Survival has become a brutal, unending calculation, and trust is a rare commodity. Meanwhile, technology exists only in fragments. Some desalination plants continue to function, powered by generators and scarce fuel. Scientists and engineers operate under extreme conditions, constantly trying to innovate ways to stretch every drop. Atmospheric water harvesting is still experimental, and large-scale irrigation is a distant dream. The balance of power is entirely dictated by control over technology that can produce water, and the people who control it hold near absolute authority. The psychological impact is profound. Entire generations have grown up without ever touching a river, swimming in a lake, or drinking freely from a tap. Memories of water are stories told by elders, almost mythic in nature. People have developed rituals and habits around water that dictate every aspect of life, from hygiene to food preparation to social interactions. Water has become more than a resource. It is the foundation of culture, governance, and identity. Globally, the absence of the United States as a reliable consumer reshapes trade, diplomacy, and military strategy. New superpowers re-emerge in water-rich regions, and former allies now compete to provide aid or extract resources from the remaining pockets of American civilization. The world has adapted, but the scars of the crisis remain as a warning. A powerful nation can collapse almost overnight if it underestimates the value of its most fundamental resource. In the end, the story of America without water is a cautionary tale. It demonstrates not just the fragility of infrastructure and society, but the profound interconnectedness of natural resources, human civilization, and survival. It is a stark reminder that water is not infinite, that scarcity can arrive faster than anticipated, and that preparation, conservation, and foresight are the only shields against a world where the tap might run dry. The storm arrives just as evening settles over the city. What begins as a flicker on the horizon quickly becomes a brilliant, continuous display of electrical activity stretching from one end of the skyline to the other. Residents crowd windows and balconies, watching forks of lightning connect with the highest rooftops. For a brief moment, it feels like nothing more than an unusually intense thunderstorm. The power stays on, buildings remain steady, and the glow of neon signs still reflects off the wet streets. It looks dramatic, but to most it appears harmless. This early calm exists because modern high-rises are built to guide lightning safely into the ground. The tallest structures bristle with metal rods called air terminals, forming the top layer of a lightning protection system designed to intercept strikes. When a lightning bolt connects with one of these terminals, the electrical charge flows through heavy copper or aluminum conductors that run inside the walls. These conductors channel the energy into deep grounding electrodes buried far below street level. This system ensures that, in a typical storm, even a strike carrying a voltage in the hundreds of millions poses no threat to the building's occupants. In these opening minutes, everything works exactly as engineers intended. The constant rumble of thunder shakes windows, but the infrastructure holds firm. Electronics remain stable because the city's grounding network disperses each strike safely and efficiently. People record the storm on their phones, uploading videos of lightning arcing across the skyline. Local weather stations monitor the storm's activity, noting that the frequency of the strikes is unusually high but not yet alarming. The illusion of normalcy stretches on, yet something feels slightly off. The intervals between flashes grow shorter until the sky barely returns to darkness before another bolt explodes downward. Meteorologists watching radar data notice that the storm cell is not drifting as storms normally do. Instead, it is almost stationary, locked in place by unusual atmospheric conditions. They recognize that this immobility is highly abnormal, but they do not yet understand the scale of what is happening. Inside the city, no one realizes that the storm's behavior defies the patterns of any typical thunderstorm. Most storms move because of large-scale wind patterns that push them across regions. A nearly motionless cell means the same area is being struck repeatedly, far beyond the design assumptions of normal infrastructure planning. The real danger lies not in what has already happened, but in what is coming next. For now, though, people assume the storm will pass. They assume the engineering will keep them safe. They assume this is just another dramatic evening. 6 hours into the storm, the mood in the city shifts. The sky, once simply bright with flashes, now pulses with a relentless strobe-like rhythm. There is no true moment of darkness. Each lightning strike sends a burst of electromagnetic energy outward, and with strikes occurring almost continuously. The city's electrical systems are under pressure. They were never designed to endure. What was initially viewed as a dramatic weather event is becoming an unprecedented electrical assault. Every lightning bolt produces an electromagnetic pulse, strong enough to induce voltage in nearby conductive materials. Under normal conditions, these pulses are harmless because infrastructure is built to handle occasional surges. But with the storm sitting motionless over the city, the pulses are occurring so frequently that they are beginning to overwhelm protective equipment. Surge protectors, inside substations, transformers, and power distribution centers absorb enormous amounts of energy, but each device has a finite capacity. As the lightning continues without pause, these components begin to fail. Transformers, which normally operate within a strict range of electrical load, face repeated high-energy spikes that exceed their insulation limits. Some units overheat as their internal cooling oil fails to keep up with the increasing electrical stress. Others short out as the metal components inside them warp or melt from repeated surges. The moment a transformer fails, it triggers an automatic shutdown to prevent further damage, cutting off power to entire neighborhoods. These outages do not happen at once, but instead spread slowly and unevenly across the metropolitan area. The city's electrical grid reacts to each failure by rerouting power to compensate, but this redistribution places additional strain on the remaining infrastructure. This phenomenon, known as a cascading failure, can begin with only one or two damaged components. In this case, dozens are being hit with intense surges every minute. As more transformers go offline, the load on the surviving sections increases dramatically, accelerating the collapse of the system. Streetlights begin flickering as voltage levels fluctuate. Traffic signals, which depend on a stable power supply, malfunction or shut down entirely, turning major intersections into dangerous zones of confusion. In high-rise buildings, elevators pause between floors as backup systems attempt to compensate for irregular power flow. The first reports of electrical fires emerge as small appliances and outdated wiring in older structures fail under the growing stress. What makes the situation worse is the storm's persistence. Because the storm is not drifting, electrical workers cannot wait for conditions to improve before starting repairs. Lightning repeatedly strikes key pieces of infrastructure, making it unsafe for crews to even approach the damaged components. This leaves entire districts with no power and no immediate possibility of restoration. By the end of the 6th hour, the city is divided between pockets of light and expanding regions of darkness. The skyline still flickers with the glow of lightning rods doing their job, but at ground level, the early signs of systemic instability are unmistakable. The residents do not yet understand the scale of the crisis, but the first and most critical pillar of modern life, the electrical grid, is beginning to crumble beneath the weight of a storm that refuses to end. 24 hours after the storm first settled over the city, the situation has escalated far beyond electrical instability. The lightning has not weakened. In fact, meteorological models would show that such a stationary storm cell could grow more electrically active as atmospheric charge continues to build. With the grid failing in large sections of the city, a new danger begins to dominate the landscape: fire. Lightning is one of the leading natural causes of structural and wildland fires, and by this point, the storm has delivered far more strikes than any urban area has ever absorbed in such a short period. The tallest and most modern skyscrapers, shielded by multi-layer lightning protection systems, continue to channel energy safely into the ground. But these systems are not universal. Many older structures, particularly those built before modern building codes required standardized lightning protection, are vulnerable. Their rooftops and exterior materials offer little resistance to a direct hit. Small fires begin in isolated pockets, often unnoticed at first because communication systems are already deteriorating. One strike ignites the roof of a century-old apartment building whose wooden beams have dried over decades. Another bolt finds the metal vent of a commercial warehouse, overheating wiring inside the walls until flames break through. In residential neighborhoods, trees are hit repeatedly. Moisture inside the trunks flashes into steam, causing sections of wood to burst outward and scatter burning fragments across yards and rooftops. Compounding the situation is the failure of electrical infrastructure. When power systems collapse unevenly, certain circuits can overload in ways that cause appliances, breakers, or outdated electrical panels to ignite. Under normal circumstances, fire departments rely on a coordinated emergency dispatch system and functioning traffic lights to navigate toward trouble spots. But with electricity unreliable and signals failing across half the city, response times lengthen dramatically. The spread of fires becomes a logistical nightmare. Roads are clogged with stalled vehicles whose electronic systems were damaged by electromagnetic surges. Streetlights are dark along major corridors. Areas that still have electricity face sporadic power spikes that complicate the work of firefighters using electrically powered equipment. Meanwhile, severe winds generated by the storm's updrafts and downdrafts act like bellows, feeding oxygen into open flames and carrying embers into new areas. By the end of the first full day, the city is no longer simply battling a storm. It is contending with dozens of independent fire outbreaks, each growing faster than emergency teams can contain. The skyline, still illuminated by constant lightning, now flickers with pockets of orange glow scattered through multiple districts. Smoke begins to blanket low-lying areas, reducing visibility and introducing hazardous air quality conditions. The modern city, engineered to withstand typical severe weather, is now encountering a type of event that no building code, emergency plan, or electrical system was ever designed to handle. And this is only the first day. The days ahead will reveal consequences far more severe as the invisible systems beneath the city begin to collapse completely. A massive lightning storm that refuses to end would not just damage a city's power grid or communication lines. Over time, the entire structure of the city would begin to fall apart in ways that most disaster plans never fully prepare for. The first major issue would be transportation. With constant lightning, airports would shut down, bridges would be unsafe, and road sensors would stop working. Emergency vehicles would struggle to move because every exposed area would be a potential strike zone. Another problem would be the breakdown of supply systems. Delivery trucks would be unable to operate normally, and the constant electrical surges would cause refrigerated storage to fail. Grocery stores and pharmacies could run low on goods within about 1 week, especially items that require cold temperatures. Even fuel supplies would become unreliable because electric pumps and safety systems would be affected by repeated surges. Water management systems would also face new dangers. Continuous flashes of lightning can damage pumps, treatment plants, and pressure controls, leading to contamination risks. Stormwater drains would overflow day after day because the ground would never have time to dry. Flooding would move higher into neighborhoods and commercial areas, even without heavy rainfall, simply because drainage systems would be overwhelmed. Hospitals would reach a breaking point as well. Backup generators can run for a limited amount of time, but constant lightning makes fuel deliveries dangerous. Sensitive medical equipment could fail because of repeated surges, and doctors would need to rely on simpler tools. Patients who require powered devices would be the most at risk. Meanwhile, long-term lightning strikes can create heat pockets and electrical fires across the city. Firefighters would struggle to contain these blazes because every time they deploy, they expose themselves to open-air danger. Even metal equipment could attract strikes, making rescue attempts more difficult. Over several weeks, entire blocks could experience rolling fires caused by the non-stop electrical activity. Psychological stress would rise sharply too. Humans are not built to live under constant flashes, thunder, and the feeling of an unstable environment. Studies show that ongoing severe storms can increase anxiety, sleep problems, and decision-making issues. In this scenario, those effects would be multiplied because there would be no break in the noise or tension. By this stage, the city government would face hard choices. Leaders would consider partial evacuations, resource rationing, and limited curfews to keep people safe. But even those actions would be complicated because outdoor movement would be risky. The longer the storm continued, the more a city would shift from normal operations to survival mode. After weeks of non-stop lightning, the question becomes whether a city can continue functioning at all. At some point, the damage to infrastructure, public safety, and the natural environment would reach a level that no emergency plan could sustain. The first major concern is long-term structural weakening. Buildings are designed to handle occasional storms, but repeated electrical strikes can slowly damage roofs, metal framing, and grounding systems. Even structures built with lightning rods would eventually face heat stress and wear. Another major challenge would be the loss of essential workers. Over time, police officers, firefighters, medical staff, and utility crews would be stretched far beyond normal limits. Many would need rest or relocation simply to stay safe. Without a full team of trained personnel, key services would start to collapse. This shortage would make it harder to maintain order, treat injuries, or repair damaged equipment. Resource depletion would become another deciding factor. Water treatment plants, fuel depots, and communication hubs cannot operate indefinitely under constant electrical stress. Supplies could not be transported easily because of the continuous strikes, and the risk to drivers would increase each day. After a certain point, keeping people in the city would be more dangerous than moving them out. Environmental changes would also play a role. Continuous lightning can spark ground fires, especially in dry areas, and those fires can create smoke that lingers over neighborhoods. In other regions, the ground may stay saturated for so long that trees weaken and fall more often, creating another layer of danger. Repeated thunder and flashes can also disturb wildlife, causing animals to flee into urban zones and create new hazards, and at this stage, governments would likely declare a full evacuation. Moving people during an ongoing lightning storm would be complicated, but not impossible. Officials would rely on sheltered routes, staggered departure windows, and reinforced transportation vehicles to reduce exposure. Emergency shelters outside the city would need to be prepared with food, power, and medical support for thousands of people arriving at once. Once the city is empty, the final challenge becomes long-term recovery. A never-ending lightning storm would leave behind damaged electrical grids, contaminated water systems, weakened buildings, and scorched land. Engineers would need to inspect every major structure before anyone could return. Restoring utilities might take weeks or even months, depending on the scale of the storm's impact. In the end, while a massive never-ending lightning storm would not literally erase a city from the map, it could force a complete evacuation and leave the area unlivable for an extended period. The true danger is not a single strike, but the slow, relentless breakdown of systems that people rely on every day.